And I think we are now live on Facebook. And so, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this event that is being organized by the History Society, Dyal Singh College Morning. I'm Ishan Sharma, and I welcome you all to this special event. And I think quite unique, even because we have different historians on the same floor of different themes of Indian history, speaking on various themes relating to the historian's craft. And in this one-day workshop come lecture series, we are going to discuss, we'll be having lectures by these eminent historians to understand the craft of a historian, how a professional historian interprets the past, reads the text, deals with evidences, and reconstruct the past. In this workshop come lecture series, we will explore the craft of a historian from a different angles and will discuss what constitutes history and how it should be configured and created in literary form by the historian. And we have a great lineup of speakers. And for ancient India, we have Dr. Smita Sehgal, Associate Professor, Lady Shri Ram College, and she'll be speaking on reading history and myths, a historian's craft, following by our modern Indian speaker, Professor Anirudh Deshpande, Professor, Department of History, Delhi University. He's going to speak on the dialogue of film and history. Unfortunately, due to some unavoidable circumstances, our speaker on medieval India, Dr. Meena Bhargav ma'am, who is an associate professor at Indraprasth College for Women, is unable to join us for today's workshop. She was going to speak on representing the medieval in Indian history, and we'll try to arrange the lecture separately. Our guest of the honor for this session is Professor Harbans Mukhia, retired professor, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and we are really honored to have him to speak on Marc Bloch and the Annales Historiography. So, without further ado, I would now invite Aliza Mirza, our first year student, to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Smita Sehgal. Over to you, Aliza. Please unmute yourself.
Okay. Am I audible, Ishanvi?
Yes.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. I am Aliza Mirza. A warm welcome to all in one-day workshop-cum-lecture series on the historian's craft. It's a great privilege for me to introduce our speaker for ancient India, Dr. Smita Sehgal. Dr. Sehgal will be speaking on the topic Reading History and Myths, a Historian's Craft. She holds a teaching experience of over 30 years. She has completed her graduation and post-graduation in history from St. Stephen's College, University of Delhi, and was a position holder in the university as well. She went on further for her MPhil on spread of Jainism in ancient India with special reference to Mathura from University of Delhi. She completed her PhD on bull cults in North India. Dr. Sehgal has worked on a research monograph titled Niyoga, Alternative Mechanism of Lineage Perpetuation, a Historical Entity in 2017. She has also contributed chapters in various books as Ecological Dimensions of Ahimsa, a historical peep into Buddhist and Jaina ethics and spiritual ecology and sustainability, practice and confluence by P. Srivastava, P. Rai, and S. Shukla in 2017. Dr. Sehgal has many papers in national as well as international conferences. She has been a member of Course Revision Committee in Department of History, Delhi University. Ma'am, your work is truly a driving force for all of us. We all are delighted to have you here. Now, I would like you to take over the stage. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you
Sorry
so
to
much.
disturb you, ma'am. Sorry to disturb you. There's just one announcement for everybody who is attending this session. If you have any question for the speaker, drop your questions in the Zoom chat, or you can comment down in the Facebook Live. Those who are joining us from sorry, ma'am, and over to you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dyal Singh College, for organizing such a important workshop on historian's craft. I also get an opportunity now to share my views on the relevance of myths in reconstruction of history. My theme is Reading History and Myths, a Historian's Craft. I have an array of questions, and let me start straight with that. What exactly is a myth? Should we take myths as a part of collective memory of the past, deliberately chosen to be preserved for long? If so, at whose behest was that memory preserved? As we all know that memory too is selective. Should we think of myths as figments of imagination, almost as creative narrations of popular constructions, and hence at loggerheads with historical empiricism? Or can we locate kernels of historical truth, rather plausible historical truths within myths? Can we go beyond the Rankenian model of looking at history only as an empirical science? Leopold Ranke, writing in 19th century, had insisted that history should reveal things as they were and should be constructed only on the basis of archival documents, epigraphs, archaeology, coins, monuments, and so on. Myths and mythology did not get into his reckoning at all. I'm really making a case for acknowledging myths as plausible sources of studying certain historical trajectories. There is little doubt that the fictional aspect needs to be sifted from the more plausible processes. I'll deal with the issue in a while, but before that, let me also say that myths have been variously looked upon in different ways in academic disciplines, sometimes as poetic imagery, sometimes as unconscious verbalization of inner desires, as mental classificatory schemes, as allegories for historical events, and so on. Let's try and understand how some disciplines have tried to comprehend what myths were. I start with a phenomenologist of religion, such as Giardus van der Leeuw and Mircea Eliade. For them, myth had to be understood as something very sacred. Within the framework of ritual inquiry, it would account for something very, one would say, something to do with the origin or the beginning or the creation. And by knowing a particular myth and recanting it in a ritual context, one could control and manipulate what was happening there. In other words, by living the myth, one emerged from the zone of profane, chronologically ordered time and entered into a sacred time, which was at once primordial, but also very recoverable. In contrast to what a phenomenologist of religion have to say, structural anthropologists such as Claude Lévi-Strauss, in his work, The Savage Mind, he states that the kind of logic that is used in a mythical thought is as rigorous as modern science. Myths, in his opinion, work as signs. Signs here is S-I-G-N-S, signs which have a peculiar character of lying between images and concepts. Signs resemble images in the sense that they're concrete, as concepts are not, but their power of reference also likens them to concepts. So the myth makers piece together their cosmologies with the cultural scraps at hand. These scraps then would stand for more than their face value. An animal within a myth, for instance, stands for not just itself, but as a metaphor for a variety of concepts and tangible objects. And for structural anthropologists, it would be more important to explore why a particular concept, animal, deity has been chosen. But in my opinion, what I want to state here is that for Lévi-Strauss, reading myth was more than looking at something sacred. He did not really bring that aspect so strongly within his own configuration. Let's take a look at what does the discipline of psychology say. Psychologists like Jung have linked myths to the concept of collective unconscious, defined as a common heritage in the unconscious of all members of human species, which manifests itself in forms of archetypes, the term that is used, archetypes, which is like a common property for all. Therefore, the recounting of the myths, the choice of symbols, the enactment within the ritual context has been explained in terms of shared psychic structures, which implies same neuropsychological responses to stress, especially in the heightened state of awareness. In fact, I read works of Jung when I was doing my own doctoral work on the cult of Bull, and I was surprised to see that when I made a comparison with other ancient societies, I was surprised to see that the kind of logic that went in an animal sacrifice in India also went in case of, say, Crete or Mesopotamia. And that is when Jung's theory came in very handy. But let's come now to the discipline of history. For a historian, reading history in myth is like a craft. A historian of mythology needs more than anything else. He or she needs a holistic approach and may gain from the insights given by Didi Kosambi in his very famous work, Myth and Reality. Myth and rituals for Kosambi were reflective of ways in which groups were evolved in a greater productive society. The fossilized and stratified remnants of certain observance along with the caste and religion then may hold the group together. So what he was talking about is like myths, rituals, symbols, all became identity markers for certain groups, and they may then also allow assimilation of other groups, or they may become a point of rejection for other groups. So a myth, its elaboration or deletion, held a key in his estimate to understanding numerous social processes over length of time and space. It may be assessed as a historical document covered under many, many layers, and each layer holding a key to a distinct history in a specific spatial and temporal context. It has been aptly said by none other than Wendy Doniger, who's a very well-known mythologist, that a myth is like palimpsest on which generation after generations have engraved their own meanings and messages, and we need to decipher each layer with a different code book. So this kind of analysis is called a toolbox approach to the study of myth. Friends, what I'm trying to suggest here is that myth is something that can be approached from different disciplines, and a student of history can actually stand to benefit from a cross-disciplinary approach. I have done that through my research work. I've taken, aspects from phenomenology. I've looked at it from the standpoint of a structural anthropologist, and also from the psychological perspective. Now, without doubt, my discipline of ancient India has allowed me to deal with myths of varied kind and helped me to reflect on the socio-historical process of the past. But in doing so, friends, I recognize that historical awareness that comes with reading of myths clearly highlights the difference in any situation, especially my situation now in the 21st century and what may have happened at the time of its composition or its movement through time and space. While I understand that while approaching any theme, I need to remember that there is that distance in the passage of time. The milieu is different, which basically means that the equations among the principal actors also alter in a different setting. In words of L.P. Hartley, who's written this very famous novel, Go Between, the past is a foreign country, which actually highlights the otherness of the past. And at times, we may find it difficult to negotiate that past. And this I say as a student of ancient Indian history. Well, if you're teaching contemporary or modern, what you're talking about may be almost something that you can relate with, or it's not so distant in past. But in case of ancient India, it's very distant in past. And therefore, we have to make use of myths, because we have to make use of all the cultural scraps at hand, anything that comes our way, but do it very, very carefully. Having acknowledged the need to be careful and sensitive in dealing with past, I need to reiterate that in any situation, the discipline of history teaches something that has a universal relevance, and that is the need to trace the beneficiary of any historical process. Yes, friends, I am looking at the politics also, which goes behind the creation of myth and its circulation. I would like to make my stance clear. I am going to talk about two myths from Puranas, which I call a storehouse of myths, and show how gender relations can be read in their days of composition. You see, myths are things that can be studied from religious perspective, genealogical, chronological perspective, from political, cosmological angle, and so on. But I want to analyze the myths from a gender standpoint. And then many of you are students of first, second, third year history. and we'll carry on with understanding how to write a paper. Friends, in that context, I must tell you that you must be very clear about your sources and make your reader aware of the sources, not just the sources, their nature, chronology, locale, social formation. And I'm just going to introduce that just to give you an idea that before doing an analysis, you should also know what our sources are. Purans are a source book on mythology, on theology, cosmogony, politics, ritual practices, all of which have relevance for reconstruction of history. Puranic texts were compiled and transmitted in a certain kind of a context, and that's very different from the Vedic corpus. The regional setting gradually becomes more and more predominant and new practices evolved. If we were to look at the time frame, the earliest of the Purans comes not before the 5th century CE in terms of its compilation, but we are very sure that the myths that were finally written down must have been in circulation a couple of years, a couple of centuries earlier. So roughly the Puranic ideas are in circulation definitely from the early centuries of the Common Era. The Purans that I'm choosing for consideration are Brahmand, Vayu, Matsya, Vishnu, and Bhagavad Puran, and they have an expansive locale, that is setting, from the Indo-Gangetic Basin to Central India. So friends, you should also tell us about the locale if you can get to know. Some like Matsya are specifically in central part of India. And later on when you study other Purans like the Kalika, it is from the east, the link can be from the south. So you need to have a sense of that and let your readers also become aware of it. Now, what is the historical rationale for composition of Puranic literature and what was its social formation? Can we suggest that one of the goals of Purans was attracting and retaining devotees and resources in a world that was becoming very competitive in terms of philosophic and religious ideas? Popularity of Buddhism and Jainism might have made Brahminical social order a little vulnerable. Along with that, political expansion was also taking place, and changes were coming even in the economic milieu during Gupta and post-Gupta period when Puranic stories were becoming very popular and also getting compiled. There was a gradual resurgence of rural agrarian economy. Of course, also there is urban too, with colonizing inroads made in the peripheral virgin tracts. A sense of unrest became dominant as new people were getting absorbed within the Brahminical political and social order, who probably did not share Brahminical worldview. So most of the Purans indicate the perception of this social chaos encapsulated in the term Kali Yuga, and this needed to be contained and new strategies evolved therein. Let us also see what was the target audience of this literature. In contrast to Vedic audience, the Purans began addressing a different set of people, women, populace of the lower orders, and also the people who had been recently inducted. And the Vedic text corpus are generally considered to be exclusionary. The Purans are considered to be very inclusionary. There was now an emphasis on different set of ritual practices, such as going to tirthas, giving dans, observing vratas, and so on. And this was in contrast to the performance of the short public rituals that were delineated in the Vedic corpus or the esoteric thought presented in the Upanishads. The discourses were often delivered in empowered places like temples, or these could be also a part of griha rituals at home, the pujas that were happening where priests would conduct the rituals. But at times, these are the stories that are narrated in a different kind of a setting. It's almost like Dadi Nani ki kahaniya, and these are just moving on. Not just the Puranic, I would say even the epics also get transmitted in this form. What stands out is an apparent presence of women within these Purans. They were there in multiple roles as mothers, daughters, wives, in a world which I would say is still patriarchal, but different historians have gauged it in different ways. So how do we gauge their portrayal? In words of Vijayanath, portrayal of women in Purans certainly does not suggest excessive marginalization. She's comparing it to the Vedic times. Rather, it speaks of an ethos very different that got reflected in the Dharma Shastras, and the society seems to have been a little more indulgent toward women. Jaya Tyagi also reminds us that within the Matsya Puran, there was an attempt to control unbridled patriarchy. And if you were to look at work of Monica Saxena, which has just come out recently, well, she says that Purans brought a conspicuous shift in gender equations by giving women the right to take a few vows of vratas. Even unmarried women could take undertake such vratas. The dominance of divine feminine in Puranic literature, and again in contrast to the Vedic, is well recognized by authors like David Kinsley, Thomas Coburn, Kunal Chakravarti in their respective monographs. However, the process could have been more complex. We really need to ask the question whether having greater visibility in the Purans actually amounted to their voices, and here I mean women's voices, being heard as well. My historical inquiry is actually related not just to the presence of women within the Purans, but the weight of their voice as well. I come to the first of the myths. This is the myth of Tamas and Sadishna. And it is very interesting. What is the context of this myth? This is a myth that was narrated within the Mahabharata, which is one of the earliest texts to talk about it, at a time when Vichitraveer is there. Satyavati is very worried about what is going to happen to the Bharat clan, and she goes to Bhishma and requests him that he should cohabit with the two daughters-in-law, Ambika and Ambalika. Bhishma says a complete no because he has taken a vow of celibacy, but then he starts narrating stories that give us the idea of the presence of a practice of niyog. Niyog is a practice, friends, whereby if the husband is impotent or dead, then through the consent of the marital family, or rather through the push given by the marital family, the woman is made to cohabit with the brother-in-law or some male member within the family. And then and the child born out of, not the child, sorry, the son born out of this union is given the name of the legal father, not the biological father. That is how it has been presented in the Mahabharata. But I must also say it is there in the Mahabharata, but not in the Sharda version of the Mahabharata. Sharda version is the Kashmiri version, which is considered to be the least contaminated. But it's there in the Nepali version, the Bengali version, another Kashmiri version. It appears in Adi Parv. And let me just recount the story. And then, of course, it has a repeat value, as I mentioned. It is there in 3 of the Puranas and other versions also of Mahabharata. Let me first apprise you of the myth. Now, according to this myth, there was a sage. His name was Usaj. He was married to Mamta. Mamta was carrying his child in her womb, who had become very well-versed in Vedas and other texts. So obviously, the fantasy element is there. You can't remove fantasy from myths. It's very much there. Usaj's younger brother was Brahaspati. We know Brahaspati is the teacher of gods, who was very learned and wise, but he set his heart on Mamta, and he sought to impose himself on her. She remonstrated and said that she was already carrying his brother's child, but Brahaspati pays no heed. His unborn nephew also protests on the pretext that there is no space for 2 children in the womb. Another fantasy aspect where the unborn embryo can actually converse, but this is what happens in the myth. So Brahaspati got so angry, even when he's trying to molest, he gets so angry that he says that when you would be born, you would be blind and old. So he is actually cursed, and when he's born, he's called Tamas. But he's very wise. He grows up in the ashram of his brother. And one day, Tamas, who has led a chaste life there in the brother's home, is left alone. The entire all family members go out for something. And that is the time when a bull, who's called Saurabh and is the son of divine cow Surabhi, wanders to the house and starts consuming darba grass. This was grass which was meant for an important ritual. Tamas caught him by horns. Again, the fantasy element. Obviously, he's blind, but he's still so powerful that he can catch him. The bull immediately apologized, but also asserted that he had not done anything wrong. He says, "Sire, I have not committed anything wrong. I have not committed a sin or a theft. There is no hard and fast rule for us bipeds. These are meant only for people like you. We are not guided by the restrictions, what should be done, what should be eaten, whom should to approach for a sexual relationship and whom not. And I am just following this law of cattle." Now, Tamas released the bull. And thereafter, he meditated on the law of cattle and got convinced about its goodness. And then After a while, his daughter-in-law comes back to the house alone. And by that time, he has set his mind right and he imposes himself on the daughter-in-law. She is so angry that she starts shouting, and in no time, all people congregate. They are very angry with what Dev Tamas has done, including his wife, Pradeshri. And what she does is to pack him off in a casket, and he and other inmates throw him in Ganges. This is part one of the story. The part two is that on the Ganges, bank of Ganges, Asura king Bali is taking a walk. He sees a casket. He then takes it out, opens it up, and lo and behold, he sees Dev Tamas, who is very well renowned, and he knows him in a moment. Dev Tamas is very obliged, and then he says, I can offer you a boon because you have saved my life. Bali is, his king, Asura king Bali is without any progeny. So he requests Dev Tamas to beget a progeny from his wife Sadishna. So it is a clear reference to the practice of neo. Sadishna is sent to Dev Tamas. She feels so repelled by the sight of the old and blind sage. Same thing happens with Ambika Ambalika, if you remember in the Mahabharata. And from a distance, she sees him and instead sends a maid. And for some time, Dev Tamas stays in the palace, and one day Bali comes to him and says, thank you, sir, you have done the work that I had asked you. You have given me kshetraj. Kshetra is the womb of the woman which is supposed to be the property of male, the husband. Says, now I have got 3 or 4 children, now you can leave, sir. So Dev Tamas at that moment laughs. He says that, remember, these are not your kshetraj. These are children born on the womb of the maid and not on your wife. And Bali was very infuriated. It goes back to Sadishna, and he now forces her to come back to Dev Tamas to cohabit with him. And he says clearly that this you have to do in name of not just your family, your familial responsibility, but also the responsibility that you have towards your kingdom. And so she has to come back to Dev Tamas, and Dev Tamas punishes her during their next meetings and makes her do things against her will, even curses the progeny that would come. But she has to quietly obey because the husband is on guard this time. She finally has sons that ensure the continuation of the royal lineage. One of them is Anga, and he's also disabled as a result of the curse. Now, what happens to Dev Tamas? Surabhi, the divine cow, was so pleased with Dev Tamas that by smelling him, relieved him of his old age and blindness. And she says, as you have followed the law of cattle deliberately and took it to be superior to all, O sinless, I'm pleased with you. And hereby I remove your blindness by just smelling you. The sin of Brahaspati is inherent in you. I, however, relieve you of your old age, death, and loss of vision, merely by smelling you. The myth as given in the Purans can leave a reader very, very confounded, especially in understanding gender relations. Gender relations, friends, you understand, are power relations that define inequality amongst the participants and also decide on how one would access the resources. Now, what we find is that within the same myth, that is in a singular context, Act 1-2, we find that somewhat similar sexual activities happen, but with extremely different implications. What Dev Tamas did to his daughter-in-law, or in some version, she's also called sister-in-law in one of the Purans, was nothing short of physical violation, something that appeared outrageous to women who are involved in both the acts and even to the society at large. So his wife, his brother, his son, everybody is outraged, and there was a punishment awaiting him. In the second case, the same act with husband's consent became an acceptable one, which is interesting. Women have protested in both, but in one case, he is thrown in the Ganges. In the other case, he not only goes scot-free, but is rewarded for it. He becomes young and sighted as a result of the boon that is given to him by cow Surabhi. In both the stages of the story, we find that women had protested. The daughter-in-law gained support from everybody, the inmates of the ashram, but Queen Sadishna is forced in the second part of the myth to go back to the Tamas under the command of her husband. What we find that in this context, a woman's sexuality was so socially regulated, and her volition mattered very little. She was violated, but it did not make any difference. She had to comply to what came as a command. So in terms of historical reconstruction, the myth stands as an example of growing constrictions where a woman could be pushed into neo-yoga relationship against her will. In terms of gender relation framework, these Tamas punishment in the earlier part of the myth was somewhere related to his violation of a kshetra, a territory that did not belong to him. It belonged to the son or to the brother in one of the stories, but certainly not to him. He had imposed himself on someone else's wife without the consent of husband, and therefore was castigated for the act. In the second case, his imposition on the woman was at behest of the husband, and so a reward was awaiting him. Clearly, a wife had no control over her body, her sexuality, and the gender relations were skewed up in the favor of the husband. The fact that the myth had a repeat value, it had a repeat value. The fact is, it had repeat value. It had appeared in 3 Puranic versions, we know, Vayu, Brahman, and even in Matsya Puran, and some later Mahabharata. It means that the mythographers had a message to convey. And what was that message? They were trying to remind women the place they occupied in the society, and the process of muzzling their voice was on. Despite the fact that we find more and more women being engaged in the Puranic literature, we find that when it comes to decision making, her voice was not there. Can we believe in the historicity of these myths? The myth in this case, from a vantage of a historian, I look upon these as only plausible historical constructions. There are so many fantasies that are strewn in, and we know that that is not possible. But what is plausible is the recognition of this particular practice of niyog, which comes through the narration of the myth. And then, as a student of history, friends, if there is something I cull out from one textual source, I would rather try and find its verification elsewhere to even believe that there is a possibility of it having some kind of historical veracity. Well, for this particular practice of niyog, around the same time, we get many smritis also, starting from Manu, Yagyavvalkya, Narad, Brahaspati, and so on. And all these smritis do talk about the practice of niyog, and particularly the inheritance right of kshetraj. Kshetraj is the son born out of it. So in a sense, we know that the practice was there, and at least that gets confirmed through this myth, though we know that the details of this myth are a little unacceptable. The second myth that I'm taking into account is the myth of Tara, Som, and Brahaspati. This myth has come in the Vishnu Puran and Bhagavad Puran, and in an abridged form also in the Matsya Puran. And again, it gives us a clue to growing complexities on the issue of women's own control over her sexuality, reproduction, and progeny. The myth is related to the genesis of Moon Dynasty, and it's like a dialogue between Maitreya and sage Parashar. And it goes back to the battle between the moon god Som and the teachers of God Brahaspati. Why? Because Som has abducted Tara, who happens to be wife of Brahaspati, and is not returning now. So Brahaspati is very, very angry. She has been kidnapped, and there is no way she can go back. So Brahaspati intervenes, makes a case before gods, and there comes a time that there happens to be a battle between Som on one side, Som and demons on one side, and Brahaspati and gods on the other side. And the issue basically was who has control over the kshetra of Tara, that is womb of Tara. This battle was a battle which could have become a world war, but Brahma intervenes and then tries to solve the issue by taking Tara back to giving her back to Brahaspati. When Tara goes back to her house and to her husband, she is already pregnant. On seeing her pregnant, Brahaspati said to Tara, the child is of someone else and should not be kept in my kshetra. Get rid of it. So Tara, who is the faithful Pativrata woman, then goes and delivers the embryo on a clump of a munja grass. That is what the myth tells us. To her was born a son of golden complexion, Buddha. His name is Buddha, and later on becomes the destroyer of Dasyus also. But the moment the beautiful, and again a fantasy part, the beautiful child is like grown up to being an infant, and seeing the beautiful child, now Brihaspati wants him back, and so does Som. Also gets the wind of the news, and he also comes to make a claim on the child. They, when they wrangled for the child, even the sages and gods became very worried. They inquired of Tara whose child it is. Please let us know, because once again a world war will be unleashed. Not just that, the child is curious to know the identity of the father. Once again, you know, we're talking about how the fantasy is getting mixed. The child is barely born and he's talking, conversing with Tara. Tara initially refused to reveal the identity of the father to either angry children, but Brahma's intervention, once again, she's not able to say, and it is said that within the myth that she's not saying it because of a sense of guilt or shame. But finally, Brahma convinces her and she says, okay, this child belongs to Soma. And then Brahma picks up the child and gives it to Soma. And for Som, he is going to then carry on the lineage. And that is how it's the lunar dynasty that would continue. The Bhagavad Puran, which is a text of the 6th century, also gives the description of the story, but adds a couple of more details to it. Let me just apprise you about those. Brahaspati tells Tara to abandon what has been placed in his field by others, but the words are very significant. He says, cast off, uproot from my field, that is, get about it, what has been sown in by others, O wicked-minded woman. I shall not reduce you to ashes, because I'm still desirous of having sons from you, but you have to abort it. The child is also infuriated by the mother's false modesty and once again says words that are very, very significant. Why don't you speak? You woman of immoral behavior, confess to me immediately your sins. Again, like Brahaspati, he's shown to have the audacity of suggesting that Tara deserved a punishment and that he's not giving her the punishment because she happened to be his mother. Again, what we find in the myth is that there is the whole tussle over the issue of paternity of the child. Does it belong to Brahaspati? Does it belong to Tara? Oh, sorry, not to Tara, to Som. The tussle is between them and the attempt is to sort that out. But what we find, that is from our perspective, it's the absence of woman's voice in decision making regarding her choice, both of the mating partner or the future of child, which becomes puzzling. And the son's reaction is actually very infuriated. He's openly calling his mother an adulterous woman. This is something very strange because within the myth, we are told that it is not as if Tara has walked into the arms of Som. She has been kidnapped. And when she's asked to go back to the husband, like a Pativrata woman, she returns also. But then probably the Bhagavad Puran belonged to an age of growing patriarchal hold on women's sexuality. And she's shown to be the envy of two men who sought to know the paternity of the child. And her reluctance to reveal the identity of the father also does not go very well down with the populace, and the mythographers use the voice of the child to further insult. So for her, what is it that is left in the myth? Nothing. She doesn't get anything. She has just the sense of shame. And from her is also taken away the right to possess a son. A son at this point in time is almost like a life insurance policy. It's something that decides for her. It does not continue a lineage, but it decides for her comfort in the old age. And that is also taken away from her. So what really was the location and status of women as depicted in the Purans? We know that there's clear idea of many more references to mother and wife, but the issue is getting more and more complicated. While on the one hand, we have Purans like Markande, which state very clearly that a man who is unfit to perform sacrifices if his wife is not there. There are stories of King Uttam who has actually abandoned the wife, and a sage comes and tells that if you abandon your wife, you abandon your future resources because the children would be born out of you. So in a sense, we can say a certain degree of importance may be given to the wife. She is an essential requirement to a man, as he could not perform ancestral rituals without them. Therefore, we can understand why Brahaspati took Tara back. Despite the fact that Tara was carrying somebody else's child, he took her back because he knew that his lineage would come with future sons. Uh, but what for women? The question is, what do these myths hold for women? We find that the Puranic masculinity was never challenged within, various texts of the Puran. The woman is warned time and again that there is no dharma, that is religion, no karma, love, or no santan or offspring without a husband. We see that Purans actually gradually raise the status of husband to that of a semi-divine being. The wife was told to be a devoted wife, a pativrata, and if she aspired any blessedness in future, it has to be through unfailing devotion to the husband. We can now understand why Tara returned to Brihaspati when Brahma intervened. Though I must say, in one of the stories, that is in the Matsya Puran, there is a line or two where it's shown that Tara enjoys company of Som. So she is able to make that mental comparison. But by and large, she is towing that line of patriarchy. We are still left with lurking questions. Was the silence of Puranic women intrinsic to their nature? Why did Tara feel ashamed of the paternity of her son, or why did Sadishna not speak up against these Tamas sexual atrocities meted out to her? From the analysis that we have just done, it appears that the silence of women was maneuvered to create an ideal social frame where their voices were made inversely relational to their growing visibility. I'm coming back to the point that I'd made earlier. Why should the myths continue, and at whose behest? Obviously, some mythographers of the day. Women were caught between the ire and desire of men as they engaged with engaged with, even when there is greater visibility, really no power. It's not as if they have not shown dissidence. Sudeshna was repulsed by the sight of the Tamas and did not go there, but she was forced to cohabit with him eventually. Tara was also forced to reunite with her husband, though in at least one version we get to know that she enjoyed company of Som, and she had to carry the mantle of being Pativrata. But interestingly, she lost control over the most important resource that she had, and that was definitely her own son, which was given to Som, who turns out to be her molester, but the biological father of the child. So in conclusion, friends, I come back to my original query. Can myths be used for historical recreation? Can these be relied upon? The answer, in my opinion, is that myths should not be taken for the face value. Obviously, there are fantasy tales that are strewn in, and they seem to be out of sync with the real life episodes. But if taken as metaphors for reference to trends in historical processes, these have immense value. Once again, we need to remember that there were contexts and milieus in which these were transmitted. So things like, there were spaces like temples, which became very important, or there were certain rituals in which they were recanted. They were part of some kind of a puja ceremony, or even if these were a part of casual gatherings inside or outside home, there was a purpose behind every myth. There would be a shiksha given to a woman through that. In any case, what becomes very important is that they were told to many generations and many locales, and in that, these myths became potent communication tools for the so-called custodians of society. I believe that the endurance of myths in some way is connected to the interest of those who wanted to maintain the patriarchal structures of the day and sought to bring about some changes therein. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for delivering this beautiful lecture, the inaugural lecture of this workshop, and on a very important topic, that is reading history from myths. Uh, a basic question for you is, when we date mythological text, epics like Ramayana and Mahabharata, what are the causations that a historian must, look for while dating these epics? And in the recent past, we've seen that some myths are being seen as history. So, how do you see that? You are on mute, ma'am. You have to unmute. I'll just Can you unmute yourself, ma'am?
Yeah, thank you. Answering the second part of the question first, Ishan, we have to be very clear about the distinction between myths and history. And what I've been trying to tell you is that myths cannot be taken at their face value. You cannot take them as such. They are indicators of certain social processes, and they have immense value as communication tools. And in that sense, they have an impact on the social milieu of the day. So if this kind of a myth, say, of Tara was being recanted to a group of women, they are being told very categorically, look what can happen to you if you are not truly a pativrata. In her case, despite being a pativrata, she has to face this. And also in the other case, that if the husband wants you to sleep with another man, you will just have to do that. So these are communication tools. They're telling this. So what I had suggested right in the beginning is that they indicate plausible historical trends, of course, not in totality. I mean, there is no question. If you were to ask me how to date Mahabharat war, I would be at sea. I just can't do that. But what I can say with a certain degree of confidence, that this particular story of the Mahabharat can be placed largely between, say, the 1000 to 500 BCE, what we say the later Vedic period. How do we arrive at that? We arrive at that from the study of language, philological study, and see how many words are there which can be called, which are still a part of the local language. Sanskrit is a very, is a priestly language, the language of gods, as Sheldon Pollock calls it. So it is slightly artificial. It is not easily accessible to the masses. It was kept exclusive. So at the time of Sanskritizing the text, numerous things can be added to it. But at the time of myths as a stories, these would have been around. So if you look at the locale, if you look at the languages, it is not very difficult to date them, though I would say many scholars are still puzzled at it. Many of the, and something like Mahabharata would have such an expansive time frame. And we state that right at the beginning. We stay with a certain degree of confidence that from the time of the Gupta period, the actual writing down of the text had started. That seems more plausible. And then the intervention and all can be easily made out. The earlier, it is on the basis of the locale, the kind of names that are being used, the studying the language, all these are being used. And that is how in case of Mahabharata, you have the Jaya Samhita, the Bharat Samhita, and the Mahabharata.
Yeah, so what you are saying is very interesting. You are saying that there is a clear dichotomy, there's a clear division between history and myth, but there is also a common thread between
Yes.
the two. Like if we want to see the underlying patriarchy, for instance, as you pointed out,
Right.
so we can do that,
We
but we
can see
cannot take that.
the social trends can be understood. And when
Yeah,
these get verified, as I took the case of Niyoga, this is verified from the Smriti text. So we know 2-3 texts are talking about it, the likelihood is more. And again, we use the term seemingly, apparently, plausibly, possibly, so that we leave our answers, our assertions a little open-ended, ready to revisit when new evidences come.
we have 2-3 questions for you in the chat, and I'll read them out for you. The first question is from Alokika. And her question is, ma'am, do we find any instance of a daughter born out of the practice of niyoga? If yes, then what was her status in the family?
Yeah. Very little reference to Niyogopana, she is called. The one who's born. She's not even called Kshetrijika, but she's called Niyogopana. In terms of narratives, I haven't come across as yet. I may come across that in later texts, but I have come across this in context of one bhashyas. Manu Smriti is one of the bhashya, and Narayan's Sandhita in the 17th century text. I've come Nirnay Sindhu. These are the two texts that talk about it. And Manu bhashya Medhatiti is very clear. He has mentioned that there can be daughters, but daughters are not accepted. They are not to be accepted. We get to know that they are actually to be raised by not the family of the legal father, but by the matul. Matul is mama. So she is given away to mama. So she has, as it is, girl children are not really looked forward to, and it's a double whammy for her. She has to face it all the more. But very few references. Most of the texts are busy thinking about Kshetraj, the son born.
The next question is, the problem we see here is when we read the thought of an historical individual in history books of one historian, it differs with the other. What a reader should do about it, of different viewpoints, I think the question is.
I personally would say that read as many viewpoints as you can. And that is one first lesson in history, that there are plethora of vantages, and we must take up each vantage and then get into the merit of the argument that is there. The plausibility, as I say, at times, if it is based on something like an epigraph or numismatic evidence, it's more empirical, certainly more empirical. If it can be constructed on that basis, the acceptance and rejection can be easily done. Otherwise, you have to look at the way in which the argument has come across. But friends, you must definitely take all viewpoints into account. Every viewpoint has to be taken, and the acceptance and the rejection would come only by meticulously analyzing each one of them.
We have the last question. This is from Keshav Bansal. His question is, you mentioned Jung's collective consciousness and concept of archetype. Would you agree that the representation of women in the myths recounted and their lacking agency could be attributed to patriarchal collective consciousness of patriarchal mythographers, whereby the archetype of the pativrata and the compliant wife was seemingly created?
Well, I would find it very difficult. I must acknowledge it right away. And what Jung was talking about is a state of heightened anxiety. He analyzed it in terms of animal sacrifices, where what I found was that when all the cultures went on for, a sacrifice, they would consider the animal that is sacrificed as a communication agent between the god and on one side, gods on one side and people on the other side. And the whole ritual drama, because you see, when I was talking about this, there's another aspect of ritual that is being drawn in. It is not simple myth. It is a myth within the ritual and a drama unfolding, everybody becoming a part of it, and a certain kind of, what I said in neurotheology, you talk about these new things that when you get a stimulus, then the parietal lobe goes completely dense, and there's certain kind of another sense of unity with the Almighty. It was in this context that I was talking about it. Here, I feel it is not really under collective unconscious. I feel it was to make everybody collectively unconscious about it. It was a very deliberate effort. It is not something that is coming as a response, a physiological response, where collective unconscious is more a reference to a physiological response. Here it is deliberately sidelining. That is the way I would interpret.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for answering all the queries. And if we have any other queries from the participants, we'll be taking them after the session, so that they all get a fair idea of all the nuances of history writing.
Right.
Now, after reading myths, now we are moving to reading films and history. And to introduce our next speaker, I would request Aliza to please unmute herself.
Okay. Now, I would like to invite our another guest historian, Professor Anirudh Deshpande, who will be delivering his lecture on the topic, the dialogue of film and history. Professor Deshpande is currently an associate professor in Department of History, University of Delhi. He has completed his graduation from St. Stephen's College, University of Delhi, and MA, MPhil, and PhD in history from Center of Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. His research interest constitutes history of early modern and modern India, with special reference to military affairs along with cinema studies. It was his deep interest and dedication in his field that made him earn various awards and honors, including ICHR Post-Doctoral Fellowship in December 1997 and Partha Sarathi Gupta Memorial Prize as the author of Best Paper submitted in History of Modern India. Professor Deshpande has authored various books such as British Raj and Indian Armed Forces 1857 to 1939, British Military Policy in India 1900, to 1945, Class, Power and Consciousness in Hindi Cinema. He also has more than 70 published papers, commentaries, reviews, and numerous articles in journals and newspapers, namely Indian Economic and Social History Review, Studies in History, Economic and Political Weekly, Journal of Imperial and Commonwealth History. Professor, we feel both delighted and privileged to have you today with us. And now, without taking any more time, I would like to hand over the stage to you.
Well, thank you very much for your kind words. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
So what I'd like to do, because it's just you have made this into a historian's craft presentation. I'm not going to present a paper, full-fledged paper on this topic. But what I am going to do instead is draw your attention to a number of questions which a historian's engagement with cinema raises. Now, this is following what Smita said earlier, in the sense, I mean, in the same way as mythology or myths or fables or epics have to be understood by the historian, especially the cultural historian, the social historian, and the historian of identity in a certain way. I mean, instead of looking at the origins of those things, if you look at them as expressions of a particular society at a given time and space. So what I have done, I have actually prepared I've prepared about 5 or 6 slides. I have indicated these questions in my latest book on historiography, the practice of history, which which I'm sure you've probably seen, which was published last year. And I'm going to present a short PowerPoint presentation. So let's begin with those questions. I'm going to basically just raise these questions and then open up the floor to a debate on these questions so that we have a dialogue between me on one side and the participants on the other side, in an endeavor to understand the ongoing conversation between the historian and cinema better. So I'm going to start sharing the screen. If it's okay, Eshan, you should tell me that it's come on, because these things sometimes give you trouble on the internet, okay? Can you see the first slide?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, so film and history, basically. Can historians ignore films? I mean, there was a time when orthodox historians used to believe that cinema is not the forte of the historians, that film is an inauthentic source of history, as source and as visualized history. Film has very little value for written history. So that's the kind of attitude which historians used to have towards other kinds of doing history as well, things like oral history for that matter, or oral tradition for that matter, or visual histories, or histories which we could put together on the basis of photographs which we have of the past, especially from the 1830s, 40s onwards. So what does the historian do with the film? Now you live in times, in fact, you've been living in times since the early part of the 20th century, when increasingly more and more people have learned history from cinema. More and more people have watched movies. More and more people have absorbed an understanding of the past by watching films, compared to people who watch films. People who actually read are very small. So if the historian does not take film seriously, then he loses the opportunity of utilizing a medium for approaching a large number of people with his ideas. On the other hand, you have filmmakers, people like D.W. Griffith, for instance, who made that iconic film about the birth of the United States, the modern United States after the Civil War of 1861-65. It's called The Birth of a Nation, which is it's an iconic film, which actually, of course, it is known also for its racist undertones, and it's basically its validation of white America versus the other kinds of Americas which you also have in American history. But he made something very clear. He said very clearly in one of his essays, he says that a time will come when people will go to a particular library in which there'll be stacks, there'll be, places where reels will be kept, and all people will have to do is to take out these reels and just see films about entire histories. And in a matter of 2 or 3 hours, matter of minutes, in a very condensed fashion, people would be able to see. People would be able to see the causes, the effects, the consequences of battles, of events, and so on and so forth. And, the need for these people to go through volumes of history, engage with arguments presented by historians from a variety of perspectives on certain events and so on, that would become unnecessary. That film would surpass written history as far as the popular notion of history was concerned. And Griffith was not wrong, because if you see how your average person approaches history today, he does it through the audiovisual medium, in the sense that he goes to he basically types a Google search, and on the Google search you get both kinds of materials. You go to YouTube, you type a particular topic on which you have films and documentaries and so on and so forth, and that's the way your common man looks at history. Similarly, people are actually absorbing more and more history through WhatsApp forwards and through short videos and documentaries which are streaming online, documentaries which are there on important transmission portals, open things like Netflix or Amazon Prime or Movie or whatever. You have many sites, many platforms on which people can go, and extremely well informed, critical historical documentaries and films are available. So it's a fact, number one. Plus, there are so many historical events which have been filmed so extensively, especially from the 1890s onwards, when the cinematograph made its appearance, and the French cinematographers and the American cinematographers and English and Italian cinematographers began to go across the world and make films on various topics. That so much film has accumulated since the late 19th, early 20th century. The First World War, for instance, was one of the wars which was extensively filmed, and that archive is available to all students of history. Similarly, after that, reams of film were produced on the Great Depression and other important events of history which happened in Europe, America, and other parts of the world. Even the colonial world, for instance, and colonized people and their lives and forests and wildlife conditions and so on. So you have in the 20th century a very huge film archive at your disposal. The point is, how does the historian approach this? What does the historian do with all this enormous amount of material which has accumulated thanks to the work of filmmakers? What kind of conversation can a historian have with this material? The historian produces history by being in conversation with the archive, by being in conversation with archaeological sites, by being in conversation with sociologists, psychologists, economists, statisticians, geographers, because history is, after all, let's not forget that history is a writing history, and the reconstruction of the past and the production of history itself is a collective effort, in the same way as the production of film is a collective effort. So, how does the historian look at the film? What questions does it ask? What questions can history pose to film, and vice versa? So, I have before you a. Can you see the triangle, Ishan?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I have a little model. I have called it the triangulated model of understanding the film. So you have at the three points of the triangle, you have three important groups of people who are involved in the social engagement with film. So obviously you have on the top, you have the filmmakers who produce the narrative of every film which is produced. Because don't forget one thing, every film is historical, because every film is a narrative about what has happened. It could be in the personal life of people, or it could be fantasy, or it could be adventure, it could be a historical narrative, it could be the narrative of women or marginal groups or blacks or Dalits and so on. But every film is a narrative film. Even the feature film is a narrative film because it tells you a story. And all stories are narratives, and historians must take all narratives, especially the social and cultural historians must take all narratives seriously. So the filmmaker is the producer of the narrative. Now, the filmmaker team would include the producer of the film, the director of the film, the script writers, the screenplay writers, the photographers, the cinematographers, those people who produce the special effects, the editors, because editing plays a very important role in creating the shots which are put together in a film, and the costume designers and so on. It's a collective effort. So who are these filmmakers? Then you have the audience. The filmmaker and the audience are in interaction with each other. Now, the historian will ask questions of both these participants in the film experience. The audience, first and foremost, must be asked why it likes or dislikes a particular film. Why are some films popular at a given time and other films not popular? Why do audiences reject some films? Why do audiences accept something? What do the audiences want to see? And if the audiences want to see a particular kind of film, why do the audiences want to see that particular kind of film? Because in the answer to this question are the most important answers of cultural history the times of cultural history which we inhabit, and the times of cultural history which have gone by, which probably existed in the 1930s, 40s, 70s, 80s, and so on. So if you can see changing audience tastes over time, you can broadly indicate, you can broadly identify the changes in the way people think over time. So it's a kind of people's choice, and the change in this choice may in fact express the change in the mentalities of these people. And of course, at the third corner of the triangulated model, you have the historian. Historian is in constant interaction not only with the filmmaker, intellectual, cultural, social, media interaction with the filmmaker, but the historian is also in interaction with the audience, and he must question both these categories of people who make the film audience, film experience complete, because there is no film without an audience, and there is no audience without a film. So if there is a film, there is an audience. And if there's an audience, there's a cinema hall, or there is a TV program, or there are, there are online likes or dislikes, there are, preferences and so on, which you can actually see on the net, or, on your emails, or your, whatever, your sites and so on. So that's very important. And the historian must ask questions of both to make sense of film. So keep this triangulated model in mind. Whenever you look at the film as a student of history, you must keep this triangulated model in mind. Now let's move on. Let me move on to the questions which must be asked by the film historian. I'm already assuming that there is somebody called the film historian. Of course, film history is not. Film history still exists in India in its infancy, but fortunately for us, in Canada, in the United States, in England, in France, in Italy, in Spain, even in Australia and some other countries, the film historian has emerged as a very important part of the community of historians. And as I have pointed out right in the beginning, if you see this carefully, I have quoted a very important film historian here, Robert Brent Toplin. And he says very clearly, gone are the days when professional historians turned up their noses at suggestions that films sometimes should figure prominently in discussions about the past. So now we are, thanks to the work of all these film historians, people like, the Robert Rosenstone, or Natalie Zeman Davis, or Toplin, or people like, Tom Gunn, or other historians like who are working on these themes. There are many of them. Marcia Landy, for instance. There are many historians who have actually created a new sub-discipline within the historical studies by taking film very, very seriously. It's like studying iconography seriously, or it's like taking numismatics seriously, or it's like taking myths or fantasy seriously in our understanding of social and cultural history. So what are the questions which the film historian must ask if he has to make sense of the films which he is viewing in order to understand their overall historical import? So obviously the first question which he will ask is, who are the film producers and directors? Are they men or women? What category of society do they belong to? In America, you would ask, for instance, is the filmmaker a black filmmaker, or a white male filmmaker, or a female filmmaker, or is the filmmaker an environmentalist, or is the filmmaker a well-known social skeptic? I mean, if, let's say, Michael Moore is making documentaries which you want to watch, you find these documentaries are extremely skeptical of the claims made by the corporate media and corporate capitalism. And they are very well informed in terms of the understanding they bring to you about the claims of these people. So, who is Michael Moore, for instance? Why does he make such films, for that matter? Or, things like, are these films being made by investigative journalists, for that matter? So all these questions have to be asked by the historian, first and foremost, to understand the context from within which the film is arising. I mean, things like whether the filmmaker is a Marxist, or whether he's a Freudian, or whether he's a liberal, or whether he's progressive, or whether whether he's reactionary, he supports patriarchy. You have to basically go through the entire background of the filmmaker to be able to understand the oeuvre of that filmmaker, the kind of genre of movies which that person was making. The second most important question, again, which is important to all history, is Why was the topic for the film chosen? Now, if you look at David, if you look at Paul Thompson's work on oral history, something which I have quoted in my book on the practice of history, Paul Thompson is very clear. He says, and he made a point. This is something which E.H. Carr also said in his What is History, and something which Eric, you have historians like Marc Bloch saying that all history has a purpose. No history is written without a purpose. What is the purpose of writing history? What is the purpose of producing historical knowledge? Historical knowledge is not produced simply because the historian one day decides and he is born with an idea that he must produce knowledge in a particular way. Similarly, if the production of a film is not an arbitrary moment in history. The production of a film is it's a carefully chosen voluntary act. So the historian has to ask, why was the topic for a film chosen? Why was a particular topic not chosen, for instance? I mean, what is the political exigency of the film? Because after all, no act of intellect is an apolitical act. So no film, no history that in that sense is apolitical or can be apolitical. So what are the politics of a film? What kind of position does that film take on social issues and so on and so forth? These are very important questions which the historian must ask of the filmmaker. Third, what is the background of the filmmaker? What kind of films comprises their genre? I mean, why did Satyajit Ray make the kind of films he made? Or, why did M.S. Sathu make the kind of films he made? Or why did Ramanand Sagar made the kind of films he made? Or B.R. Chopra made the kind of he made? These are questions which you have to ask very, very, very carefully. And then you have to go to the directors, the producers' genre and see the kind of films they've been making. And the kind of novels they've been taking up for making these films, the kind of scripts they've been using, and so on and so forth. This is a very important, this is doing the same thing which the historian does with a particular historian's book. He goes through the biography of the historian, he sees the context of the historian, he looks at the ideological background of the historian, and then he begins with a certain assumption which starts guiding his reading of the book and so on and so forth. It's like when we take historiography seriously and the historians who write that historiography seriously, similarly, you have to take the filmmakers very, very seriously. What is the aim of the filmmakers? What kind of film are they making? Are they making mass escapist entertainment, or they want to educate people in a particular way? Is the film a documentary, which is very critical and educative? Is the documentary overtly political? These are important questions which you have to ask, which you ask of biographies, or which you ask of other source material which you find as a historian. Is the film a feature film, or historical, or documentary, or reportage? Why has the film been made? Who is the script writer of the film? What is the ideological inclination of the script writer? So if you look at, let's say, if you look at Govind Nihilani's early movies, you find that in most of the films, the script writer was Vijay Tendulkar. Now, what kind of a script writer was Vijay Tendulkar? What kind of a playwright was Vijay Tendulkar? What do we know of Vijay Tendulkar? What perspective does he bring to the film by writing a particular kind of script? Why do the films become so explosive? So those are questions which you have to ask. The script remains very, very important for the film. The script is as important to the film as the archive is important as the primary source is to the historian. So if the film is a historical film, let's say, assume that the film is a historical film. Historical film could be a period set costume drama, or it could be a biopic. If it is a historical film, are historians involved as subject experts in its making? If historians are involved in the making of a film, you'll find, in many documentaries which are streaming now on Netflix, for instance, if you see if you see documentaries on Kublai Khan, or if you see documentaries on the Ottomans, or if you see documentaries on this age of samurai, or any kind of documentary for that matter, or even if you see documentaries which are which are based on case studies of people fighting injustices uh, done to them by the corporates in the past. This was a very lovely film, a very lovely documentary made on the thalidomide children in England, in Britain in the early 1960s, in which the very famous, honest, truthful, and critical journalist Harold Evans played a very, very important role. They involve historians, they involve experts, and the experts keep coming in, and their opinion is constantly sought in the making of that film. So all these things have to be researched by the historian. The historian has to see all these things and then develop a holistic understanding of the film which has been shown. And if historians, especially historians, are involved in the making of historical, what is the historical viewpoint of those historians? If Sanjay Leela Bhanchali, let's say, if he took the advice of some historians while making Padmavat, what did the historians tell him? Is it really a historical movie or not? These are questions which the historian of the film has to ask. Finally, if the film is based on a work of history or historical fiction or novel, what is the nature of these texts? How have these texts been read by other historians earlier? What kind of reviews of these texts are available to the historian? These are extremely important questions which the historians have to ask while analyzing a film. Now, there's a concept of reading the film. How should the historian relate to film? In fact, there are many ways of reading a film. If you look at you can read the film like a text. In the same way as you read a documentary, if you read a document in an archive, or you read a book in a library, or you read a magazine, or you read an article, you can read the film. So how does the historian read the film? While reading the film, the historian can do, one of the four things, or all four. One, the historian can see the film as a historical source. Historical sources, film as a historical source can include feature films, documentaries, or historical films. In this case, the footage is used by the historian to support his generalizations, which are obviously based on archival and other research. And you often find, scenes from films or scenes from documentaries being used in textbooks to support the generalizations made therein. Two, the historian can see the film as representative of an ideological position. So here you have film as male gaze, or film as hegemonic, film as nationalist or counter-hegemonic, as in let's say new wave movies of the parallel cinema, neorealism, or movies which were developed by people like Fernando Solano's movies, which were developed in Latin America, and they began to be referred to as the third cinema, which are basically very different from Hollywood cinema and European auteur-based cinema. This is third cinema. This third cinema is a very vigorous cinema, which is politically very active, very conscious, and it is supportive of people's revolutions across the world against imperialism and colonialism. And that's where you have very large, very good documentaries like The Hour of the Furnaces by Solanos, or you have Claude Lanzmann's iconic documentary of the Holocaust called Shoah, and so on and so forth. So there's no doubt. Or in India, you have films like Hey Ram by Anand Patwardhan, or Final Solution by Rakesh Sharma, and so on. Three, the historian can see the film as a source of inspiration for more historical research. Now, this is very important. So the dialectics of film, more film and reading and back to films. Here, the historian is attentive to the sensitive nature of film because film conveys emotion like very few books do. So you can start looking at something. Let's say let me give you an example. You can see the 66 episode Simon Bolivar on Netflix, uh, and Netflix actually produced part of it. Part of it was produced by Colombia's national television, the Colombia's television company, Caracol TV, and you have Simon Bolivar. So you have, as an historian, you look at Simon Bolivar's entire life through these 66 episodes. That may make you more curious about who Simon Bolivar was. In fact, there's a Simon Bolivar Marg in Delhi. There's a road named after Simon Bolivar, but most of us students don't know who Simon Bolivar, the liberator, was, in South America. What's his role in the international legacy of anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism? So after looking at this, you read more about him. Then you can read, after that, you can actually go to Gabriel Garcia Marquez's last novel, The General, in his labyrinth, to understand what the last journey of Bolivar was like. You can go through the entire, you can go through the memoirs of Simon Bolivar, which were collected by O'Leary, his ADC, and they were published posthumously later on. And they've become a very important source for the writing of the history of those civil wars, which were very important in the early part of the 19th century, through which people from Venezuela and New Grenada actually got rid of Spanish control, and South America was liberated for the first time. A large part of South America was liberated from Spanish rule. So it becomes, a film or a documentary can inspire. It's like observing something and then be inspired by that to read more about it, and then come back to more cinema about it. Sometimes a topic may have several documentaries on it, and then you can watch all of them and see the differences between them, and you can keep reading side by side and then develop a very holistic and critical understanding of the subject. 4, the historian can turn filmmaker himself and produce a unique way of narrating the past through biography and edited film. Now, technology makes this very easy. You have excellent cell phones on which you can make small films. You have cameras. You have now handheld, easy to use technology, which a historian can use himself. So if you are a good historian, if you are an intrepid historian, you are a historian who takes film seriously, you can actually make a small film for your students or your friends, and you can develop amateur. You can actually ask students to become amateur filmmakers who do history. You can historical monuments, archaeological sites, even important people, your neighborhood histories. All these things can be done by becoming a film historian yourself. So to the historian, the film can never be simple entertainment. It is like another narrative or document which requires careful reading, analysis, criticism, and review. And how does it revise the historian's perspective on the key issues of this subject? Does it deepen the understanding of historical events, causation, and process, which forms the core of history as a subject? Should historians watch films to begin with? Historians, of course, remain divided in their approach to films, but I would urge the historians to watch films regularly and watch cinema very, very carefully. Now, let me just go back. I had mentioned the feature film as a possible source of history. How does the historian look at the feature film as a possible source of history? There was a time when the historians used to trash feature films, saying that they are all useless. They are basically family dramas and costume dramas. They're basically, they're like shorter versions of soap opera where, all's well and that ends well. And most Hindi movies would end in marriages and, the end and so on and so forth and all that. They would be, a boy would meet girl, they would go to college, not study, dance around trees, sing songs. There would be some opposition from their families, which would be overcome by the young couple. Finally, there would be a bit of dishum towards the end of the movie when a villain would, appear from somewhere who would be stalking the girl and so on and so forth. And finally, there would be a very nice patriarchal end to the movie. And that's how movie after movie was made. So the orthodox historians tend to dismiss the feature film, also called commercial cinema in India, as fantasy with little or no historical value. Now, this is one view of commercial cinema. Nonetheless, I would suggest that social and cultural historians should take mythology, epics, folklore, and legends seriously in their analysis of mentalities. And now the study of mentalities is crucial to histories focused on examining social change. Since there are no bare facts in history as such, the historian is left with no choice but to take all cultural expression in society seriously. In this, he is helped by the sociologist, the psychologist, the economist, the statistician, the geographer, the filmmaker, and so on and so forth. So you have two positions, in my view. You have two positions on the dialogue between the historian and the feature film. Number one, the historian can and, in my view, must study cinema for being representative of its time. It's like studying all cultural artifacts. Not only studying the production of that artifact, but also studying the meanings which those artifacts convey to society. Because by understanding these artifacts, you understand the culture of people. You understand the way people think, because it's not merely the historian's job to tell you what was being produced when. It is also the historian's job to tell you what people thought and how these thoughts changed over time or did not change over time. So the answer to what people like and want to see on the screen is important in historical context. People want to see what they want to see, right? People want to see, for instance, people want to see a different image of themselves on the screen. They want to see an idealized image of themselves on the screen. And that's how they identify with these idealized images produced by the feature film. And that's what explains, the longevity of the feature film as a successful genre. People live out their fantasies through these characters. And you can call it false consciousness or you can call it sublimated consciousness, but this is extremely important for people and they find release in these films. So, for instance, you can ask a very simple question. Why did the quote unquote angry young man films, which used to usually, of course, not all, but most of which used to usually star Amitabh Bachchan in the 1970s, why were they successful? Or why has Devdas as a tragic theme been loved by Indian audiences since the 1950s? There are so many Devdases have been produced. The latest, which was produced a few years ago, starred Shah Rukh Khan and I think Aishwarya Rai and so on and so forth. In some, what do people prefer? And that remains important to the cultural historian. In this way, a typical Hindi film can be seen as representative of dominant patriarchal values in society. People prefer that. Let us remember what Satyajit Ray said about the Indian audiences here. And in one of the videos, he very openly calls them people with backward consciousness, people who are reactionary, backward, who are not very good, conscious, forward-looking audiences. And he says that's why this trash which is produced by Bollywood is constantly circulated and is popular in India. 2. Now, this is, of course, part 1 is looking at film as a symbol of mentalities, film as an expression of the way people think, film as a representative of cultural values which people prefer. So if a film is very popular and audiences have been interviewed regarding the popularity of those films, if songs of particular films are very popular, why are these songs very, very, very popular? For instance, I'm reminded of what Sudhir Kakkar once said about Mukesh songs. He said Mukesh songs are very, very popular because actually they Mukesh was a very popular, he became a very popular singer, and his sad songs became extremely popular in India simply because most Indian women and most Indian men whose love lives remained unconsummated felt immediately attracted towards these songs, and they thought that these songs were the best avenues for the expression of their own lost loves and their frustrations and so on. Because India is not a see, as a society, it has never been very kind to people who fall in love, especially people. Of course, Hindi movies don't make you fall in love with people who are from other castes and religions, but it's a very rare occurrence in Indian movies. But even otherwise, the level of individual choice in society is so restricted. The liberties which individuals have in our society is so restricted that that such songs became extremely. He said this captures the soul of an Indian lower middle class woman. These songs. That's why they used to be so popular. That's one way of looking at movie. The other way of looking at feature films is to see. Now, this is where you have you have some French historians who actually take the feature film very seriously, because they say the feature film may actually contain important historical evidence. The feature films, according to these scholars, contain incidental evidence of the times in which they are made. And because the evidence contained in the feature film is not intentional and incidental, the historical evidence which you can glean from a feature film is extremely important from the point of socio-political, cultural, other kinds of histories. So if historians can access the unedited film, they might come across, in a film archive, they might come across interesting historical evidence, quote unquote, and this makes the film an archive open to extrapolation. But for that, you need to have historical archives. Film archives. The only film archives in India are to be found in Pune, in the FTII, and they are in a very bad shape, let me tell you. So if you were to have a very large film archive in which the film producers would place at public disposal for the public unedited versions of their films. Now, what you see as a film is a carefully edited version. But there's an unedited film. Let's say you may have several thousands of feet of film which have been edited out. Now, if that complete unedited version is available to you, you might actually come across extremely important evidence, cinematic evidence of the times in which the films were shot. So the films shot both indoors and outdoors contain a fair deal of incidental evidence, let's say of fixtures, of furniture, of fashion, of architecture, town planning, forests, lakes, gardens, vehicles, mountains, animals, toys, food, celebrations, weapons, tools, and so on and so forth. There's so much of social history, economic history, which is, things like currency, things like prices, and they may be mentioned importantly in films. There may be price lists of hotels which might just appear, and you might actually see, actually, if the film, let's say, made in the 30s, which give you, let's say, a list of restaurant prices, then you can actually if you have a number of movies which talk about these things, you can extrapolate from that and actually see how cheap things were during the Great Depression, when there was a price crash across the world. Or things like weapons, for instance. What kind of weapons were being used at that time? What kind of revolvers were being used? What kind of ammunition was being used? And you have, what kind of animals were being used in movies? What kind of animals are available to see? Your cities, what were the cities like before the plastic revolution? Were they cleaner? Were they as dirty as they are right now? What did the roads look with less vehicles? For instance, if you look at the movies in the 60s and 70s, you come across, very broad, big roads in Delhi, Bombay, many Indian cities with very few vehicles. And you really get, you get a feel of what kind of place this city must have been. Buildings, architectural design, the kind of preferences for drawing room furniture or bedrooms. All these things tell you a lot about people's preferences and their cultures and their aspirations and so on and so forth. Therefore, the feature film remains important to the cultural and social historian in two main ways: film primarily as mentality and film as incidental evidence. And now this brings me to the last slide of my presentation, after which we can have a brief discussion on the themes which I have raised in my brief talk on the historian and the film. So now finally, the historian and the historical film. So as I have said earlier, all film per se is historical. Nonetheless, the period historical and documentary command a special place in the film historian's field of study. And what should be his approach to these be? So after asking the questions mentioned in the triangulation model, those of you who haven't seen this, let me show you. This is the triangulation model I talked about, in which the historian asks questions of the filmmaker, and the historian also asks questions of the audience. And he looks at the relationship between the filmmaker and the audience on the basis of a simple assumption, which is very important, that there is no film without the audience, and there is no audience without a movie. So if you look at the historian and the historical film, these are the 10 questions which the historian must ask of the historian of the historical film. And these can be any kind of historical film. It can be a war film, it can be a period historical, it can be a biopic, or it could be, a documentary, and so on. Number one, is the film accurate in terms of events? Can its imagery be reconciled with the credible interpretation of facts? So, I mean, let's say if a film is made on the Third Battle of Panipat, and if it is shot not in Panipat but somewhere close to Indore, then can that film then really convey the sense of geography of that battle? That's the question which you have to ask, number one. Number two, what is the interpretation of facts offered by the film? Is it one-sided, or does it provide a balanced view? I mean, if historians are called in to provide their voiceovers in between, what kind of historians are called in? Are they going to give you one perspective, or are they giving you several perspectives, in that sense? What kind of text is the film based on? Is it myth or an authentic historical narrative which can be verified? Now that becomes very difficult in a country like India, because most historical films in this country are based on mythologies and not on carefully crafted history. That was very clear when Padmavat or Rani Lakshmibai and other films were made. How accurately historical were they is something which the historian has to see. Is the film nationalist, fascist, socialist in orientation, as I said earlier? Is the film Freudian? Of course, in India, it's impossible to make a Freudian film openly, but of course, in France or in the US or in UK, you can still do a very open film, a film which exposes human emotions. If you watch Mary Queen of Scots, for instance, on Netflix, it's a very, very, very good small film about it's a film about Mary and Elizabeth in their relationship. I wonder whether in India we can actually make a film like that. Let's say on a love-hate relationship between, let's say, Akbar and Jahangir, or some other characters in history, because that kind of nuanced filmmaking requires a certain sophisticated understanding of history, as it were. In the case of documentary films or serialized documentaries, what are the sources of the filmmaker? Why is the documentary made? What testimony informs it? Does it use techniques of juxtaposition of time? So nowadays you have documentaries where you have, time is juxtaposed in frames. So Robert Rosenstone is very fond of these documentaries. I also like such documentaries. You have the same person being interviewed 20 years after a particular event. And both the frames, both the footages are used simultaneously, sometimes juxtaposed, sometimes one after the other. And whether this person is contradicting what he used to say 20 years ago. Many movies they're using this. And this is extremely important, because this actually makes the narrative go narratives go very beautifully back and forth between the present and the past. What is the condition today? What did he think 20 years ago? Is there a difference in between? And then you'll have a police officer who was involved in the case, let's say 30 years ago, who then expounds on what this person is saying today, what he said 30 years ago, whether and what kind of discrepancy is there between what he said then and what he says now. So there's a great amount of truth verification and re-verification in this entire process of, juxtaposition of frames, or succession of frames. So these are extremely important ways of doing history. This is something which film can make you do. See, if you write a book which is linear, you have to go back 50 pages to read something. But here what happens, the filmmaker puts both the frames together. So very quickly you can actually shift between frames and see, how things are. It's like say let's say you want to explain the continuity in US policy towards, let's say, Nicaragua. And if you have a film on the US invasion of Nicaragua in the 1890s, even if it's a feature film which is very realistic, and you have contemporary frames and contemporary shots of recent interventions in Nicaragua. If you put them together and you have dates, then the viewer very quickly knows the continuity of the policy. See, these guys have been doing this since 1891. Things like that. Or you have a series of frames. So you can always, filmmaking is a very, very creative, it's a very creative art, and you can approach past time and spaces in a very creative manner through the techniques of filmmaking. Eighth, does the documentary or documentaries on a single subject inspire the historian to read and research more? Now, is it inspiring? Let's say you see a documentary on Nicaragua. Are you inspired to read more about Nicaragua? Let's say you see a documentary on Pablo Escobar, the king of cocaine in Colombia in the 70s and 80s. Are you really you really want to know about why cocaine was grown in such large quantities in Colombia? Who grew this cocaine? Why was it exported in such great quantities to the United States? Why did the US react to it? What were the cash flows like? What was the political economy of cocaine? And what role did people like Pablo Escobar and the other, other narco chaps play in this? El Chapo and other people, who were very famous, who became very rich. These were people who used to feature in, the Fortune 500 and the big magazines which talk about rich people across the world. And there were a time when these people were mentioned amongst them. So what is narco-terrorism, for instance? If you have to really understand these things, these documentaries are very important. Then after you see these documentaries, or while you're seeing these documentaries, you're inspired to research more and read more. Now, if the historical film or biopic privileges one viewpoint among many, why does it do so? So you have to get down to the ideological basis of the ideological preferences of the filmmaker. Finally, can documentaries document true popular life? Because history is not only about events and great men. So what kind of an adjunct are they to our understanding of popular life? So you have documentaries on sugar, you have documentaries on honey, you have documentaries on food habits, you have documentaries on bottled water, you have documentaries on solar energy. You have documentaries on so many things. Critical documentaries are available on so many things which will make you aware, which will actually increase your awareness as a historian living in the contemporary time. And as you know very well, it is the historian's task to constantly be at the crossroads of the present and the past. So the more aware these movies make you of the present, the more sensitive you become towards the contemporary times in which you live, times which you inhabit, the deeper and more important and salient will your historical questions become. Your scholarship will develop an edge. You will become more politically conscious, and you will know which side to be on to be able to change the world into a better place, which I think is the most important task of critical history. So I bring my presentation to a close with this last slide, and I look forward to the to the question answer session after this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Deshpande, for such an engaging, enlightening, and interesting presentation. And when you were talking about film, I was thinking about films like Hakikat or Devanand's Hum Dono or LOC Kargil for that matter, or recently the Ghazi attack, which featured war in movies. So my question to you is that how do Indians understand themselves and their nation through its film industry's cinematic representations of war?
Indians are a very deeply nationalist people, and I don't think they will tolerate anything which is critical of nationalism on the screen. So really, critical filmmaking has a very small space in a country like India. I mean, that happens only with extremely brave film producers and directors who often are who often have to circulate their own movies uh, on online platforms and by way of uh, video CDs and so on. So that's what Anand Patwardhan does. He's made films like Hey Ram, and he's recently made other radical critical documentaries about contemporary India. And uh, I completely agree with Satyajit Ray when it comes to the large majority of Indian audiences.
The next question is from Aditi, and
I
the
mean, leave
question is,
alone
will it?
film. Now, leave alone film. Now you've come to a stage when even writing something is not very easy in this country. So filmmaking is completely, especially critical filmmaking, is a very, very difficult task to. I think it's a very brave thing to do in a country like India right now.
Indeed, sir.
We have a great tradition of banning films and taking people to court and filing defamation charges against them. You filing courts admitting police admitting FIRs and filing FIRs without even looking at the seriousness of the charges and so on. So it's a very risky. Even student bodies interrupting film screenings, and as you know, it happened in Delhi University and JNU other places. So it's not even short biographies, which are which are truth-based and which are authentic footage-based biographies or documentaries. Even they are very difficult to screen and show. I'm very sorry to say that, but India is no country for the critical filmmaker.
Hmm. The next question is from Aditi, sir, and the question is, will it be all right to assume that films have as much an impact on the opinions and ideology of the audience as compared to the role played by the audience in the making of the film?
As compared to the,
Making of the film.
I didn't get the question.
Will it be all right to assume that films have as much as an impact on the opinions and ideologies of the audience as compared to the role played by the audience in the making of the film?
Obviously, it's a dialectical interaction. I mean, a filmmaker makes a film. He invests money in it, and if he finds that the film is popular, he tries to make another film like that. That's how you get sequels. Sometimes the sequels work, sometimes they don't. But audience responses are taken very seriously. There are agencies which do it very, very consciously and very carefully for the filmmakers and for TV programs. And I mean, like you have these like TV channels do these TRP things. I mean, they go through the TRPs carefully, and then they actually tailor make programs and tailor make their broadcast in accordance with the TRP. They come to know what people like. So, and by constantly reinforcing what people like, they mold people's choices. And you have when you watch Netflix, when you watch a particular documentary or a film, you always have a like dislike. You have these two icons on the underneath the main icon. So if you say I've liked a particular program, automatically the Netflix starts showing you those kinds of programs on your more of those styles start appearing. So they're already molding your mind. So they want you to see more. Suppose you like murder mysteries or crime thrillers, so they'll keep showing you crime, and you become distracted from other things. So these are all these are not film viewing. Like writing history is not a very innocent task. as E.H. Carr. If you see E.H. Carr was very early. He said that. He said the a historian's view of society is likely to be the same as his view of history. So similarly, they are not innocent. This is not a matter of free choice. These choices are all constructed choices. You have to be very careful what you watch. I mean, just because you want to develop an interaction with cinema doesn't mean you start watching everything and giving it more importance than books or your archives or other source material. I'm not saying that at all. The historian has to be critical of everything which he sees, everything which he reads, everything which he observes.
So the next question on our Facebook Live is from Rajni ji, and her question is, what do you think of counterfactual movies like Inglorious Bastards, and how should historians read these kind of movies?
There are, many films are counterfactual films. So that's fantasy. Inglorious Bastards is fantasy, right? And it's most of Tarantino movies are fantasy films. Inglorious Bastards with the E is but then the way in which the movie is constructed, it also speaks of the resistance, the struggle, and the possibilities of getting rid of the Nazis. So it's a good film. I enjoyed it. It's not a historical film. Tarantino does not call it a historical film. You can have counterfactual films, but they have their value in terms of sending a message. For instance, how does the Nazi mind work? For instance, how does the Nazi hunter's mind work? I mean, you may probably find a parallel with, you may find parallel in history with that kind of character constructed by a historian. You have to watch it not for its historical value. Obviously, nobody was gathered in that cinema hall and the entire thing didn't go up like that. Or Goering and Goebbels and Hitler, nobody died like that. We all know that. But it has value in terms of at least upholding the value of resistance to fascism, which is very important.
So the next question, the last question probably, is from Abhilash, and his question is, how does a student of history access the fidelity of cinema as a source to understand the present realities? I think you have answered
that question
partly
has
in
been
your.
answered. If he had paid attention to the talk, he would have understood we have already found the answer to the question, which was there in the slides which I presented. In the same way as the historian looks at other documents, in the same way as the historian reads the film, in the same way as the historian reads a book or a newspaper report or a document. I mean, just because you find a document in an archive, let's say you find a police report filed in an archive, does not mean that the report is authentic. You have to actually verify that. In the same way as an investigator looks at the difference between actual evidence and circumstantial evidence, the historian also has to fix responsibility for a particular cause, and that simply cannot be done on the basis of finding something. You have to stitch the story together, put everything in context, make an interpretation, and then make a viable, successful case study. It's like a piece of excellent criminal investigation. Marc Bloch once, as Professor Mukhia will be in a better position to say, because Marc Bloch at a particular place says that the historian sometimes has to be like a very good detective. See, like a detective who arrives on the scene after the murder has been committed, the historian also arrives on the scene of history after the events have taken place and the murders have been committed. So it's like a post-mortem which he carries out. So for that you need forensics, you need you need doctor's opinion. Similarly, the historian has to then take all those things into account before stitching a credible narrative. I mean, if you really want to really read a book, if this boy wants to read a book of that sort, which has been done by a very, very good investigative journalist who of whom Marc Bloch would have been very proud, is Aviruk Sen, who wrote that very famous book Arushi on the so-called unsolved murder case, double murder case, which took place in Delhi in 2008. If you read that book, and a film, Talwar was made on the, a film was made on that, in which Irfan played the role of the investigator. So if you see that book, you read that book, you see the way Aviruk Sen, a seasoned journalist, marshaled the evidence presented by the police. He looked at all pieces of evidence so carefully. He's looked at the map of the flat very carefully. He's actually come to, he actually questions the entire theory on the basis of which the parents were sentenced for the murder of their daughter. And he talks about media trial. He talks about a number of things which played a very important role in the construction of that case in the media. If you look at it, I think it's a brilliant piece of investigative journalism. And I think the investigative journalist, a well-read investigative journalist, is like a historian, only that he does not lecture in a classroom. I think Ravish is a very good historian. He's a very good contemporary historian on NDTV. So, I have mentioned him in my book also. And he's been actually, he was our student. He's from the Delhi University History Department. So there are many ways of doing things, Eshan. It's not, you don't do it one way. See, there are many ways of doing things. The only point is you have to arrive at the truth, and on the basis of a credible narrative, which interprets that truth.
Thank you so much, sir, for answering all the queries. And if we have any other query, we'll take those towards the end of the session of the workshop. Now, I think it is the time to invite our guest of honor, Professor Harbans, Gesser, and though he doesn't need an introduction, but I'll read out a small introduction. Last year in 2020, he completed 60 years in the profession of teaching and writing about history. Professor Mukhia started his career in 1960 from Kirori Mal College at Delhi University, and before joining Jawaharlal Nehru University in 71, he also worked at Rajdhani College and Hindu College at Delhi University. He served at JNU from 71 until his retirement as rector and professor in 2004. His essay Was There Feudalism in Indian History? Led to an international debate in the Journal of Peasant Studies between 1985 to 93, the Feudalism Debate. Professor Mukhia questioned the Indian feudalism thesis at the theoretical plane and then at the empirical level by comparing the medieval Indian scenario with the medieval Europe. Was There Feudalism in Indian History was reprinted in the pages of a British publication called the Journal of Peasant Studies in 81. Within the next few years, it had created so much interest in international circles that in 85, a special double issue of the journal centered on this paper, comprising 8 articles from around the world, and the original author's response to the 8th was published under the title Feudalism and Non-European Societies, which was jointly edited by T.S. Byers of the SOAS London University, was also the editor of the journal and article's author. It was also simultaneously published as a book. The title was adopted keeping in view that the debate had spilled over the boundaries of Europe and India and had spread into China, Turkey, Arabia, and Persia. The publication of the special issue, however, did not terminate the discussion. 3 other papers were subsequently published in the journal, the last one in 1993. The discussion often came to be referred as the Feudalism Debate. A collection of concerned essays was published in New Delhi in 1999 under the title The Feudalism Debate. And today, Professor Mukhia is with us to speak on a legendary historian, Marc Bloch, on whom this workshop was centered, on a legendary book that he wrote, The Historian's Craft. And without further ado, I would formally invite Professor Mukhia to address the gathering, and so you can unmute yourself. And thank you so much for accepting our invitation.
Well, thank you very much, Ishan and my friends, Anirudh and Dr. Sehgal and others. Yes, it's a pleasure to participate in this kind of discussion with such brilliant colleagues as we have had just now. After listening to these two very, very outstanding presentations, you asked me to speak on Marc Bloch and Annales historiography. I'll come to that. But I think before I come to that, I like to make a passing comment on the points that were discussed earlier in these two presentations. One is that the problem that has arisen about myth, about mythology and history, the distinction between mythology and history is in a way a problem arisen from the terminology that is used. Myth and reality, D.D. Koshambi's famous book. Myth and reality seems to suggest mythology is fiction and reality is fact. So myth and history, they get equated with fiction and fact. You see, so one is fiction, the other is fact. And as a historian, we don't take into account fiction. We only take into account fact. Therefore, there is a kind of almost a derisive attitude towards mythology as fiction. It's all right for entertainment, but it's what has that got to do with history? But actually, on the point that Smita, Sehgal, and Anirudh, in a way, were discussing in different contexts, is that the facts of history are not merely on this day, on this year, this event took place, or such and such a ruler came to the throne, he fought such wars, etc., etc., etc. These are not the only facts of history. The facts of history are also equally important. Facts of history are how do people's attitudes towards X, Y, Z evolve? How do people's attitudes towards perceptions and attitudes towards women, for example, towards sexuality, for example, towards children, legitimate or illegitimate children, for example, towards anything, towards death, for example, towards the birth of a female child, for example, and so on and so forth. One can go on. How do these Abul Fazl mentions in Akbar's time that, Akbar celebrated the birth of a granddaughter, contrary to custom. Contrary to custom is extremely significant. So he's telling us, what the custom is. Custom is not to celebrate a daughter's or granddaughter's birth, but nonetheless, how do these attitudes towards birth of daughters evolve and change, and so on and so forth. So the kind of social change, mental change, change in attitudes, perceptions, cultures, everything, these are also as important historical facts, empirical facts, as the coming of a king to a throne and his wars and battles and this, that, and the other. So I think this problem of use of language, namely whether it is to distinguish between fiction, mythology, and history in terms of fiction and fact, is itself a very, very misleading kind of it misleads us completely in a wrong direction. But that's just by the way. I was fascinated by the discussion that took place. So it just occurred to me to just put in my word that facts have different meanings. You see, facts don't have only one. Historical facts have different meaning. Anyway, I'll be dealing with this point also myself. Anyway, now Marc Bloch. Let me go back to 1929. When Marc Bloch and his friend Lucien Febvre, they were both young scholars located in Strasbourg University. They founded a new journal called Annales. It's written as Annales, but it's pronounced Annales. S is silent in French. So it's Annales d'histoire économique et sociale. Annals of history, economic and social. So Annals of economic and social history. That's how it was founded in 1929. Now, why did they found this journal? What was so different about this journal? in my brief intervention, I'll just try to emphasize the difference that Marc Bloch made to the discipline of history, how he redefined the discipline of history. You see, that's what I'll concentrate on, focus on. In a way, I have to. I admire two very great historians, because both of them redefined the discipline of history. One is Abul Fazl, to whom I just referred, who also redefined history in many very profound ways, and the other is Marc Bloch, who in a way left a different kind of history to us than he had inherited. So, why did they found this new journal called Annales? The title Annales kept changing. Annales d'histoire économique et sociale. It kept changing once in a while, but Annales was most of the time there. Anyway, so why did they found this journal? They were very dissatisfied with two aspects of the discipline. More than two, but let me concentrate on two. One was what they called the oppressive schisms, the schisms of various kinds. Schisms of periodization. This is ancient history, this is medieval history, this is modern history, this is such and such history. That's one kind of schism, or if you like, schism. They emphasized, Marc Bloch in particular emphasized, the time, historical time, is a flowing time. It doesn't get interrupted. History changes all the time. He's virtually obsessed with, he defines history at one place as that science of change. History is that science of change. Constantly things are changing all the time. And in every aspect of life, of life in the past, they are changing. And yet, the change is not so abrupt as to be marked in this period and that period and third period and so on and so forth. Change is a constant feature. It's a feature which occurs all the time, and it occurs everywhere. Therefore, what they call the oppressive schisms of periodization, ancient, medieval, and modern, etc., etc. That was one reason why they wanted to found a new religion. A new journal. The second schisms that oppressed them was there is political, administrative history of kings and queens, and so on and so forth. There is economic history, there is social history. Primarily, of course, what was studied all over the world was history of kings and queens and their accessions and dethronement and battles and administration and so on and so forth. But there was also a bit of economic history as a separate branch whatsoever, and a social history and a separate branch whatsoever. This was the second schism that they found oppressive. Because they really thought that you cannot really divide history into these branches: economic history, political history, social history, this, that, and the other. History is is an integrated whole. It has to be studied as a single unit, as a single whole, rather than in terms of its separate, independent entity, as independent entities, economic and social and political history, and so on and so forth. And the third, which they didn't call schism, but in a way it could also be included in the term oppressive schism. It's their term that I'm using, oppressive schisms, which they used in the two-page introduction to the first volume or first issue of Annales to our readers. That was the title. The third element of it was complete isolation of history from sister disciplines, what they thought were sister disciplines, of various kinds. economy, of course, geography, of course, human geography in particular, sociology above all, psychology, and so on and so forth. So as they said in this short introductory note to Annales, each one is cultivating his own field. It's time to look at the neighbor's field. Look at that field, and you'll gain a lot from that. So it's time to look at the other disciplines, and they will greatly enhance your understanding of history, uh, uh, rather than concentrating, focusing on political history, administrative history, economic history, this, that, and the other, in isolation from other histories, not only other aspects of history, but in isolation from other disciplines, which they greatly emphasize, and in which they were greatly inspired by Durkheim's sociology. They admit their debt to Durkheim's sociology. They also criticize. They also point out its failings, but they admit their debt to Durkheim's sociology, where the emphasis was on structures, studying of structures of society, whether in the past, present, or future, or not in the future, structures of society, so that it is the structures that they are concerned with. They were constantly being ridiculed by anthropologists and sociologists and so on and so forth, with their obsession with what they call event. An event is what is at the center point of a historical investigation. Such and such a ruler came to the throne on this date in this year, etc. He fought this battle on that date, etc., etc. An event is the main concern of historians, and the anthropologists and sociologists, but anthropologists in particular, ridiculed that obsession, because they said, what is an event after all? Event is like a wave in the sea. It comes and goes. It leaves no permanent impact behind. What does leave permanent impact behind in societies are not these events which come and go, but the impact on societies, whether in the past or present, are how socialization takes place, for example, how cultures are imbibed in family, in community, in neighborhood, in your township, how values are imbibed, cultures are imbibed, how these are socialized, and these without any it's a silent kind of process. It's not a process. Also, force is used, but mainly it's a silent process of socialization of women into a certain kind of role in their family, socialization of boys into a certain kind of role in society, and girl children in society, and so on and so forth. So the process of socialization is what it leaves a long-term impact behind, rather than a particular event. So that they ridicule the historians on their obsession with events, and ask them to look at larger, much longer processes in society in the past than an event. To which the historians did respond, partly in terms of the Annales historiography, the Marc Bloch and Lucien Febvre initiative on Annales historiography. They looked at structures mainly, in fact, almost to the neglect of events, they looked at structure. Or Fernand Braudel conceptualized time, historical time, division of historical time, not in terms of past, ancient, medieval, and modern, but a different rhythm of time. For each historical problematic, a different rhythm of time operates. He conceptualized time in three different categories. One was time, the longue durée, very long duration time, which lasts centuries. And this time is what, or even millennia. This is time, this is the time, category of time, which explains changes in the ecology. He studied the Mediterranean in the age of Philip II, which was a major intervention in the major focusing on the theme of ecology, Mediterranean. I mean, not the Mediterranean Sea, but society, etc., alongside. So that long durée, running into centuries and even millennia, is what geographical or ecological changes, what explain geographical and ecological changes. And the second was, what was the second? Conjunctures, yeah. What the second, first was this long durée structure, the second was conjuncture, which runs into decades, which explains trade, for example. Trade makes sense not in one particular year or one particular half decade or something, but over decades, the secular growth or decline of trade makes sense only in terms of decades rather than in terms of short periods of time. And the third was the event. So that a different conceptualization of time occurred as a reaction to the strictures that had been passed by very derisive comments that were made by anthropologists in particular to the discipline of history then. So we move from historiography moves us from the event to the structures of society and structures of change, structures which lead to change over long time, over long durée. This is where the first shift in terms of the discipline, in terms of changing the course of the discipline occurred. The second shift that occurred was, which is very, very significant, equally significant, was a point that Anirudh almost ended with, namely, multiplicity of plurality of explanations. Well, the second point was a departure from the inheritance of positivism and Marxism, which was the legacy of the 19th century and early 20th century. Positivism, I think, is best encapsulated, well, empiricism, but there is a difference between empiricism and positivism. I'm aware of that, but it's often also used as a synonym. So I'm using the term positivism, which includes empiricism, positivism is, I think, best encapsulated in Leopold von Ranke's very quick statement, very pithy statement. History tells us as it really happened. It's a very fascinating encapsulation of positivism, or what was known as scientific history. He was, in a way, the father of scientific history. Scientific history was the very fashionable term in the 19th century, first half of the 20th century. It still is, but it's losing its sheen somewhat. For reasons maybe we'll be able to discuss. But so what does what does Ranke say about how does he encapsulate his scientific history in these 7 words in English? History tells us as it really happened. There are 3, in a way, emphases here. One is history tells us as it really happened, not historians, but history tells us as it really happened. How does Historians may be wrong, their information may be inadequate, their interpretation may be questionable. So the historians don't tell us. I mean, they try to tell us, but they may not be able to tell us as it really happened, as the truth of history. So who tells us? History tells us. How does history tell us? History tells us by collecting all the data of history, all the empirical data of history is collected. When all the data is collected at one place, history will then talk to us unambiguously, without any ambivalence. History then will tell us as it really happened. The history will give us that single fact of history, the single truth hidden in history from us, hidden so far from us. History will, in its completeness, history will tell us as it really happened. It's not the historian, but history in all its completeness. It will tell us, telling is a very significant term. I'm telling you such and such a place is a marvelous place. I'm telling you such and such a university is a very good university. I'm telling you so and so is a great historian or whatever. So that telling is a very important figure of speech. So history tells us as it really happened, tells us finally with a finality. There is no ambiguity, and this lack of ambiguity is further emphasized in the term as it really happened. There can't be any doubt about what really happened. So that this is what they had inherited, the notion of one single truth hidden from us, one objective truth hidden from us, which is also imbibed by Marxism. Hidden truth, Marxism and positivism, there is a lot of difference between them. Positivism emphasizes the primacy of facts, empirical facts. Marxism emphasizes the primacy of a perspective on these facts. All these facts make sense only in a particular perspective. By themselves, they don't make sense. So that, but there is a difference yet. But yet, Marxism also inherits this notion of one objective truth, which is hidden from us, which we'll be able to recover by and by through increasing knowledge. So what Annales historians did was, historiography did was, it greatly enlarged the space and scope of history. Not merely Ramkian kind of history recovered from archives about kings and queens, and that's what the archives mostly tell you about kings and queens and their battles and so on and so forth. But much wider. They invented the term. They conceived of the term history in its entirety, which has been translated into total history in English. It's not a very good translation. Total history seems to imply a totalizing history. Annal historiography is not totalizing. It doesn't have one totalizing explanation of all historical phenomena or facts or whatever. It doesn't have a single totalizing explanation. So it's not a totalizing kind of historiography, but therefore total history is not a very happy term. I think history in entirety, which is also the literal translation of their term that they have used, French term that they have used, which is anyway, history in its entirety. Anyway, so what Marc Bloch and Lucien Febvre did was they enlarged the space and scope of history to include everything under the sun. Nothing is excluded. History is not confined to a particular phenomenon or set of phenomena and so on and so forth. History is everything, all history, or everything in its entirety. And therefore, they also needed to enlarge the databases of this history. this enlarged space and scope of history. You can't get the data about understanding social practices, about mental mindscapes of people, about culture, etc., from the archives. You can't get much, Therefore, various they included folk tales. Marc Bloch was among the first to use folk tales, epics. He also did a lot of field work in the countryside of France, to recover what he called the lost cultural values of the past, which still survive in the minds of people. Apart from the fact that he also found abundant fields, the shape of abundant fields, which gave him a great understanding of medieval medieval agriculture. But mindset of people, cultural residues of people in the mindsets of people, his ecology, his symbols, various kinds of symbols, when you go to the church and bend before Christ, before the cross. This is a symbol adopted from the medieval homage to the Lord. When the vassal goes to the Lord, he bends before the Lord in the manner in which you bend before the cross in the church in the year 2021. So, so symbols of various kinds and so on and so forth. He also studied tombs and paintings. There is a marvelous statement of his in Historian's Craft on this. Let me read it out to you. The paintings and sculpture of sanctuary walls and the arrangement and furnishing of tombs have at least as much to tell about dead beliefs and feelings as 1,000 contemporary manuscripts. He's looking at dead beliefs and feelings through paintings and tombs and so on and so forth. Our knowledge of the Germanic invasions had derived as much from the archaeology of tombs and place names as it has from the examination of charters and chronicles. So he's looking at a different set of databases, completely different set of and all-inclusive set of databases. In fact, Marc Bloch's first book itself was translated into English as The Royal Touch, Le Roi Tomatage. The royal touch is, it was believed everywhere, including in India, it was believed that in the medieval times that the king's breath can cure you of diseases, or a glass of water touched by the king or part of it drunk by the king or touched by the king can give you lots of benefits, good harvest or a son or whatever. So why did people believe in this royal touch? So it's a study of their mindset, really. That was his first book, really, Le Roi Automatage. And Lucien Febvre's great book, Problem of Unbelief in the 16th century. There was the great figure called Rabelais, who wasn't an atheist, but he didn't believe. It was a midway between belief and atheism, unbelief. How did this problem of unbelief in 16th century, is it possible to think of in the 16th century somebody who doesn't fully believe in the existence of God and religion? So he writes a whole book on this problem of unbelief, making Rabelais the center point of this. So that expansion of the scope of history and expansion of the scope of databases. That is what and bringing in much more than material kind of not only material evidence but material kind history around these kinds of material kind of history, if you like, They expanded it to include beliefs and mindsets and so on and so forth, culture and so on and so forth, which ultimately led to mentality or mentalities. In French, it is mentalité, single, but it should be mentalities. Now, this also leads them to ask, what is a historical fact? Ranke had told us a historical fact is an objective fact. Go to the archives, find out all the objective facts, put them together, and they'll yield to you an objective reality of the past, an objective history. Are the facts really objective facts? Are they all true facts? This is a simple question today. It's almost simple to ask, almost elementary to ask this question. Nobody asks this question anymore. But when they were writing, they were rewriting the discipline of history. These are basic questions they were raising. Are these facts given to us from archives or wherever? Are these really? Are they really given? Are they really objective realities? Lucien Febvre called this an idolatry of fact. It's an idolatry of fact. Take a fact as it is given to you. Don't ask any question. You worship it as you worship your idol. Or he even went on to say, collecting facts of this kind is like collecting matchboxes. They don't make any sense. You can find pleasure in collecting matchboxes, but they don't yield any picture to you. So that facts are not objective. Facts are not given to us. Facts are constructed facts. Facts are, as Marc Bloch put it, I think in Historian's Craft, facts are, all the historical facts are psychological facts, in the sense that they are registered in the minds of those who write and those who read. And from that mind, one registered in one mind, registered by one mind on paper and read by another mind from that paper. These are all being constantly reconstructed by their minds, and therefore they become psychological, not in the sense of being imaginary completely, but in the sense of being constructed by human being through human intervention. Each fact is a construction of human intervention, whether you write it down or you convey it orally, or you remember it, or you reminisce about it, whatever. Each fact is a constructed fact, by human beings. There is a human intervention in this fact. The notion of objective fact would be which is impervious to human intervention, like the earth is round, which is an objective fact. It is human interventions can't change the shape of the earth, but historical facts are in themselves constructed by human intervention. They are not objective in the sense of nature is objective. So that apart from facts collected from archives or wherever, you need imagination. Imaginative reconstruction is the term that Marc Bloch. You have to use imaginative reconstruction. Use your imagination to get sensitive to what people thought, how they felt, what they did, etc., etc. Don't merely leave it to the facts that you have collected from the archives. The third, whatever number, difference that they made was, positivism and Marxism give you a permanent hierarchy of permanent causal hierarchy. There are many causes for any event, but there is a hierarchy of these causes. This is the main cause. Other things also, yes, but this is the main cause. This was particularly elaborated by Marx, and particularly Engels after the death of Marx, when somebody, his name was also Bloch, Joseph Bloch, he wrote 1888, I think. He wrote to Engels, Marx and you have greatly emphasized economy as the center point of your discussion of everything. Aren't other factors also important? And Engels wrote back saying, yes, of course, we emphasized economy because it was being neglected. But yes, of course, other facets are also important. But he added, in the end, in the last instance, the economy is a deciding factor. You see, these are his words. I think deciding factor is my word, but in the last instance, it is the economy which explains, So this last instance, the permanent hierarchy that I'm talking of, permanent causal hierarchy that's constructed, they are challenging that permanent causal hierarchy. They are substituting for it a moving hierarchy of causes. Each event, major event, has a different causal hierarchy. Not all of them can be reduced to this last instance or any one instance. All of them have moving causal hierarchies. And let me give just one quick example. Bangladesh, whose creation 50th year of whose creation we are celebrating now. Bangladesh didn't break away from Pakistan for reasons of economic oppression so much as linguistic oppression, suppression of their language. So was there, but it is a suppression of their language which led to the revolt in East Pakistan and led to Bangladesh. So that in this case, for example, economy is secondary, culture is primary, namely question of language. So that each event or group of events or circumstance has a different kind of causal hierarchy. There is no permanent hierarchy of causes. And that I mentioned this earlier, change in every sphere, constant change in every sphere. In fact, Marc Bloch is constantly, the notion of kingship, the notion of nobility, serf, knight, field, everything is changing constantly. In fact, he divides the feudal age into two feudal ages, the first and the second feudal age, and he mentions that if a visitor from one feudal age went to the other feudal age, he mentioned that the feudal age lived by the constancy of things, that things never change, things are always the same. That was their mindset. But in fact, the fact was that if a person from one feudal age visited another feudal age, he wouldn't be able to recognize it. So profound was the change, which was occurring daily, every day. It was occurring, accumulating over centuries. So that change is there all the time. Every single day there is a change, something or the other. There is a change, and therefore. He's constantly, in a way, comparing the present and the past. He's constantly referring. It was like this. Today it is like this. So in a way, he states at one place, one must look at the present or what was recently the present in order to understand the past. In his book French Rural History, so that so that you can understand the present, the past only in terms of, because the questions that arise in your mind today in the 21st century or 20th century or whichever century are questions of your environment, your ambivalence, ambience. They are not questions. You are putting this question to 16th century or 14th century, but the questions that you are raising are questions of your ambience and your mind and your circumstances, not the questions of, they are not questions which would have arisen in the 16th century or 14th century and so on and so forth. So in a way, this was also encapsulated slightly later by Benedetto Croce, the Italian sociologist, major Italian sociologist of the 1930s, who said all history is contemporary history. So that all history that you study has a relevance to the contemporary history, because you go back to history, historical evidence with questions that are in your mind, in today's mind, in today's historian's mind, not of the present. So immediately there is a link which gets established between the past and the present, whether in terms of Marc Bloch or in terms of Benedetto Croce or many others. So that very, very new questions were, very, very new shifts were being marked by annal historiography. And in a way, there is a transition through this, from positivism to postmodernism. There is a kind of transition that transits through this annal historiography in some way. Let me say that postmodernism has a lot of garbage in it, a lot of stupid kind of, what shall I say, arguments in it or suggestions in it. Total garbage. But postmodernism, particularly Michel Foucault's postmodernism, did do one thing, namely, I'm reminded of Anthony Giddens' one essay, which he starts by saying very provocatively, post-structuralism is dead. And then he begins to recapture what post-structuralism has contributed to our understanding. Now, I think he, in a way, establishes his distance, at least, from post-structuralism in the opening statement. And yet he recovers what post-structuralism did contribute to our understanding. So I think postmodernism is a lot of garbage, as I said, but it did do one thing, namely, it did demolish completely the notion of one objective truth, which was so central to the scientific history of Ranke, so central to it. You couldn't really, you would recover that one single truth, objective truth, from your researches if you go on. So that the notion of single truth in history, one objective truth in history, that was demolished completely by many facets of many branches of postmodernism, particularly Michel Foucault's branch of postmodernism. And therefore, the legacy of all these events, all these developments, was that we have now come to accept as a commonplace, as a common sense, that there are plurality of views about history. There is not one single view of history. There is not one single truth in history. There is not one single perception of history. There is not one single conclusion which we can draw from history. There are many, many truths in history, and many, many ways of looking at history. But then it doesn't really mean that your truth is your truth and my truth is my truth and they're all okay. The question of evidence, the authenticity of evidence, the authenticity of inferences drawn from this evidence, the logic of inferences drawn from this evidence, that still remains central to the discipline of history, with all the finer finer kind of embellishments to it which have been made over the last 100 odd years. That characteristic of history as evidence-based and with a logical explanation, that still remains intact, mercifully. Thank you very much. I hope there are questions. Yes.
Thank you so much, sir, for delivering this lecture. And yes, there are questions. And the first question is that you mentioned the term scientific history. that was in vogue in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And in reference to that, he wants to know the problem with the distinction of scientific and humanistic study of history. Is such distinction valid or tenable to begin with? And
Okay.
when Marc Bloch talks about history in its entirety, would it be correct to assume that he is advocating a balanced study of history that incorporates both scientific and humanistic reading analysis of history?
Yes, okay. This is, I'm sure it must be from a student, which is therefore a very, very good question, from a student, yes. One is, what is the distinction between scientific and humanistic history? The one, of course, is calling yourself, calling your discipline science is sort of elevates your status, as it were, and the most sort of unscientific so-called disciplines insist on calling themselves science. I'll tell you a very funny example. Probably you don't know of these. There is a system of healing called pranic healing. There is a Reiki and there is a pranic healing. Pranic healing is. I wanted to understand, so I did this course actually. Pranic healing. I wanted to see what it is all about. I think 2 or 3 courses I did, and I'm supposed to have become a certified pranic healer. I can't heal myself though. But anyway, the pranic healing is, they sort of, there is a halo around each one of us, and the halo sometimes expand with a lot of garbage in it, and then you have to clean it, and so on and so forth. You don't touch anybody. You can do it. You can do pranic healing to somebody who's sitting in New York, so supposed to be. And they insist that this is a scientific method, So the one time when I did this course, they were insisting that they say, what can be more, what can be sillier, more unscientific than this kind of. Yet, then, so I'm just saying that it's also a way of raising your status, as we are also scientists, because the whole thing came, positivism actually descended from natural sciences, you see. Then it came to social sciences and so on and so forth. Auguste Comte, the founder of sociology, used to state that sociology is number 1 in terms of reliability, and mathematics is the last in terms of reliability. Because mathematics has no objective basis. You see, mathematics, everything is imaginary, even the figures that you 2 and 4 and 20 and whatever square, and these are your imagination. There is no objective basis, and therefore mathematics can't be relied on, according to Auguste. So this was their thinking, of science. You see, because it came to us from science. It came to us from science because science makes this. Science has the data before science is. There is the objective reality. I mentioned the Earth to you. The Earth is flat. I'm sorry, the Earth is round. It's an objective reality. The distance between the Earth and the Moon is an objective reality. You can't change that objective reality. Therefore, they can. Therefore, there is a difference between. There is a distance between the objective reality which a scientist studies and his subjective perception of that reality. Like once again, Earth. At one time, humanity believed that Earth is flat, but that was the subjective perception of the Earth. But gradually, we came to realize that actually the Earth is round. So because that is the objective reality. So ultimately, subjective perception of the Earth being flat was eliminated by the objective reality of Earth being round, as we found it. So you human beings can understand that objective reality, but can't change it. That's a given to about scientific methods. You can't change. You can't intervene in changing that reality. Now, this is not the case with any of the human sciences. You see, I mean, I mentioned earlier, Marc Bloch said all facts are psychological facts in the sense that they are created by human beings. All facts of history are created, history or economics or political science or philosophy, they are created by human beings, and therefore they cannot, by their very origin, they are not impervious to human intervention, they are, so that the very methodology of studying the two is very different. Now, I don't see why we should feel inferior to scientists or science, studying science, those who are studying science, because our methodology is different from their methodology, so that one must recognize the difference between what is called what are the natural sciences, which study an objective reality, and all others, all other disciplines, they study sciences or forms of knowledge which are humanly created, created by human beings, you see. So there is a world of difference between the two. And the second, and scientific history was coined exactly in emulation of that objective reality of which I was talking. That there is an objective reality in history which will capture, just as people capture the objective reality of the Earth's shape, So there is no such objective reality in history. And about Marc Bloch, yes, he actually he not only created balance between one and the other. His mind is very vast kind of mind, very inclusive kind of mind. So yes, he was not anti-Marxist. He was not a Marxist. He was not an anti-Marxist. They were just or others. They are just positing a different view of history, which was different from positivism and Marxism, as I said. But it's not supposed to be a challenge to Marxism or positivism as such. It's actually taking positivism and Marxism a step further, elaborating it further, adding to it facets which had been ignored earlier, and making history much more complete than positivism or Marxism had left it. But it's not Marx. I'm sorry. Marc Bloch was not antithetical to Marxism. None of these historians of the Annales school, great historians of Annales school, Jacques Le Goff and Georges Duby and so on and so forth, none of them were anti-Marxist. Yes. Okay. Sorry for this long answer. Yes.
Thank you so much, sir. There's an interesting question for all three of you from Shivam Gupta, and his question is: what remains the way out for the students and professional historians to claim back their space in a time where distinction between popular and academic history is increasing at an alarming rate? So maybe Professor Mukhia can start, and then Professor Deshpande and Professor
Well,
Sehgal.
I think this distinction has always remained and everywhere. It's not merely peculiar to us here in India or today. It has always remained. You see the popular perceptions about all these rulers that we talk of, whether it is Ashok or it is Akbar or it is Humayun or it is whoever, they are very, very different and not necessarily hostile. In fact, in this Mehrauli area where I studied, I stayed for a long time in JNU. I used to go to Mehrauli area, and one story I heard there in some kind of a dhaba was that Muhammad Gauri, ये तो अपने वो उस बगल वाले गांव का लड़का था. He was kidnapped by these Turks, Muslims, and carried away. Then he came back home. He became a Muslim and he came back home and recovered his territory. So it's a very, very kind of homecoming for Muhammad Gauri, which is totally so contrary to what we study in history, professional history, So their distance has always remained, But what is happening today is that history is not merely what is popular history, what we have received from popular memory, but it's being manufactured in a manner to increase the distance and posit that as real history rather than the history that Anirudh Deshpande and Smita Sehgal have been studying and teaching. Very that, according to them, that is the real history. This is a false history. So how do we counter it? Well, we have to make our not to retreat. We have to make our presence felt. In a way, that's what you are doing, Ishan, through these webinars and so on and so forth, which is a wonderful way of making our presence felt. Yeah, Anirudh and Smita, would you?
Anirudh, so you
Smita
can
has
unmute
to
yourself.
unmute.
Yeah.
No, she has. Okay.
Yeah. Well, I just thought, as Sir, you have rightly mentioned, that we basically need to reiterate the need of studying history. What we are studying at times, what people have a popular perception about history is something that just gets transmitted generation over generation as a popular folklore, and it doesn't really is not founded on study of history. So studying history in a very professional way, something that is being taught in our university and other universities, in a very professional, scientific, scientifically, this is what is the importance. And well, where the distinction between a historian and people at large does come up. The second thing we need to remember that history has often been a handmaiden of politicians. So we need to be a little more careful about that and take everything that is mentioned with a pinch of salt and do our own little research to figure it out. And the best part is there is a lot of material available.
Sure.
Go into the, as we say, the first lesson that we give in our class is, well, go back to primary sources. Looking at those sources and then trying to reconstruct, so many, I would say, mental cobwebs get cleared just in the process of just reading, doing your own reading to it. Of course, interpretation with that comes with years and years of being in this discipline. From first year to say MA final, you are a changed person altogether. So studying it professionally is what I would definitely recommend.
Absolutely.
And then making out that difference, as you say, with the others, you should get into that debate with your friends who make this kind of assertion and get that clarified.
Professor Deshpande.
Well, I think I've already sent you a private message. You can read it out.
Okay.
Sure. So, so I'm speaking on behalf of Professor Deshpande. He says they must adhere to the truth and they should not be afraid of speaking truth to power, as Edmund said, wrote.
Not Edmund, Edward.
Edward said, wrote. That is the task of the historian, and participants can read a great book by Professor Deshpande, and I have a copy of the book, The Practice of History in India. It was published by Akar Books last year. So it is available on Amazon. So students and academicians can go through this book, very lucidly written for students. And I have also recommended this book to all the students in our department, and other students should also read it. Thank you so much, sir, and thank you so much, Professor.
Sorry, I just have to say something.
Yes, sir.
You see, a multiplicity of interpretations does not mean the negation of truth. Postmodernism ends up negating the truth. That's the problem with postmodernism, because ultimately what the postmodernism does, it says, your interpretation is as good as mine. Your subjective interpretation is as good as my subjective interpretation. From there, Keith Jenkins, then he starts deducing that actually history is, they say history is fiction, basically. Historians just write footnotes, and they try to, they have no, as Hayden White used to say, they don't have any method and so on and so forth. Something which I disagree with completely. As Professor Mukhia said, and as, as Dr. Sehgal said, historians have a method. History is a very rigorous discipline. It has its own philosophy. It has its own interpretative practice. It's not an easy discipline to practice. It is a multidisciplinary subject. It is a collaborative, collective enterprise. And it is not to say, just because you keep interpreting the past again and again doesn't mean that there is no truth. There is truth. Because if you start denying the truth in the past, you end up denying the truth in the present. And then you start moving into what is called a post-truth society in which truth does not matter. But there is truth like, like colonialism, imperialism, racism, the Holocaust, oppression, slavery, things like that. And these are extremely uncomfortable truths of history. Truths not in the sense of events or personages, but truth in the sense of systems, in the sense of modes of production, in the sense of modes of suppression, oppression, and so on and so forth. And for that, I mean, the historian has to keep alive to, I mean, he has to be alive to all those things, and he should speak about them without fear. That is how history has to be written.
Thank you very much, sir. And there are a couple of questions for Smita ma'am and Professor Deshpande. Ma'am, if you can, yeah, sorry, sir.
I think it's time to relieve us. It's
well, if there is
past 2 now. We have been
Professor Mukhia wants to leave. I think we should allow him to go.
Sure, sir. Sure. Thank you so much,
I think
Professor,
so.
for being
thank
a
you.
part of the workshop. And it was truly an honor.
What was the question, Ishan?
Sir, for Dr. Sehgal, the question is, where can we make myth relatable with history? Because we always differentiate history in criteria of truth and interpretation.
I think she answered that question.
Is this question for me? I think.
Yeah, I think you've answered that question. So,
okay.
I mean, I think you've answered that question in your presentation. That if it wouldn't be relevant, then you wouldn't be studying it in the first place.
Obviously, absolutely, absolutely.
Another question.
People live by those myths even now.
Yeah. And that's what I said, that why should these be in circulation? I think that needs to be understood.
See, you see, people who don't know where they themselves were born know the exact place where Ram was born. So, I mean, as long as those things remain relevant, I mean, myths will remain relevant. You have to keep interpreting them variously and differently.
Absolutely. That's true.
So this is a question from Pragya Paul to you, Professor Deshpande.
I think let it be the last question. After this, we'll just...
Yes. So this will be the last question, and then I'll invite Dr. Amarjit Singh to deliver the vote of thanks. This question is from Pragya, and the question is, how do we measure the element of historicity in a film? Because the element of historicity, or what one considers as history, is also very subjective. So how do we measure this historicity?
So there is no scale by which you measure historicity. History is subjective. That does not mean history does not have truth. History is subjective only insofar as a number of people look at history differently. That does not mean all those who look at history differently are all equally correct. So I don't buy this argument that there is, I mean, you cannot say that, I mean, if tomorrow somebody turns around to me 20 years from now and says, no, in India, the emergency was declared in 1968, I'm going to say that is untrue, that is wrong. The emergency in India was declared in 1975 and it was lifted in 1977. You may have different, I mean, if somebody turns around and says, no, emergency was a very democratic thing which happened in India, I'm going to say that is untrue. If somebody tells me that the US has been a great real advocate of democracy and freedom across the world, I'm going to bring into his view all the activities, warlike activities of the United States since the 19th century to prove that there is no bigger enemy of freedom and democracy in the world than the United States of America. So there are unpalatable historical truths which exist irrespective of subjective historical perceptions. Just because there are many perceptions, many interpretations, does not mean there is no truth. Because that denial of truth will lead to the destruction of knowledge itself. See, being critical and being skeptical is not the same thing as being a denier. You can't live in denial. If you're a historian, you have to say something. You have to generalize on the basis of the arguments and the facts which you put together. And your generalization has to be substantiated In the same way as a medical generalization has to be substantiated with clinical trials, with case studies, with research done on the basis of peer-reviewed medical journals on the basis of which the generalization is made. Similar is the case with history. This whole nonsense about, history being subject. Everything is subjective. Everything is subjective does not mean there is no objective truth. 2 plus 2 remains 4. It never becomes 22. Okay. I mean, Harbans Mukhia Sahab said, Auguste Comte said, mathematics is the least of the exact sciences. But if somebody would have given in exchange, in change, if somebody would have given Auguste Comte 20 francs instead of 40, he would have asked for 20 more. So there is something called economic interest. There's something called economic history. There is something called production. You may talk about culture, you may talk about society, you may talk about languages. But also, let me tell you, all these things which we are using are industrially produced. Without production and production relations, there is no history. That is also an objective truth of history. So there are many kinds of histories. There are many objective truths of history. And the sooner a historian realizes all those things, the better. I mean, I have mentioned all these things in my book. You must have read that book. And I have taken a dig at the postmodernists in that book when I have said that, I mean, a postmodernist, if he is not given his pay, will be the first one to try to prove that he is working in a department to earn that pay, right? So you may marginalize for a little while economic history, but economic history and state data and statistics remain very, very important. You have things like causation, you have things like connections and so on and so forth. So this is very fashionable nowadays to say it's my opinion. You have no opinion. All your opinions are expressions of social opinions. There is nothing called individual opinion. There is no individual. In fact, all individuals are representative of social tendencies. ये कई बार हमारे ये बच्चे भी घर में बोलते हैं ना, ये मेरा ओपिनियन है. मैंने कहा तुम्हारा कोई ओपिनियन नहीं है. तुम्हारा ओपिनियन रिप्रेजेंटेटिव ओपिनियन है. तुम नहीं हो, तुम सोसाइटी के बनाए हुए हो. You are already part of a context. So don't exaggerate your individuality also. Please try to understand that. आजकल ये बड़ा फैशन में चला है ना, आजकल बड़ा फैशनेबल हो गया. इट्स मेरा ओपिनियन. अरे तेरा ओपिनियन, तेरा बकवास ओपिनियन है. बोलने में क्या जाता है? जो बकवास है वो बकवास है, जो नॉनसेंस है वो नॉनसेंस है. हिस्ट्री के मतलब ये थोड़ा ना हो गया कि जो मन में आप बोलते रहेंगे उसको आप हिस्ट्री बोलेंगे. ऐसा थोड़ा होता है. इट्स लाइक सेइंग कोई फेक न्यूज बोलेगा, कोई फेक न्यूज फैलाएगा, बोलेगा मेरा विश्वास. अरे तुम्हारे विश्वास से क्या होता है? Who gives a damn to your vishwas?
Can I just add a little thing here? I think most of the things have already been expressed by Anirudh in this. Just a little thing of, about the way postmodernists had begun looking at just the micro, and the macro and the whole has disappeared.
No, they have not even. No, they have not even done micro history was done by people like Carlo Ginzburg. Carlo Ginzburg is not a post. He's a solid historian. He's a solid historian.
No, one little place of a little climate of a little area, and you just leave it right there. No connection with the whole. No connection with how do you read fluctuations? How are you able to form opinions? Just pick something up, leave it there. That is my personal problem with the postmodernist.
The biggest problem I have with postmodernism is that it leads to the denial of truth. See, tomorrow, let's say you take a case in which you have, let's say there's a rape. The victim will have a perspective, the oppressor will have a perspective, society has a perspective, the media will have a perspective, the police inspector will have a perspective. The village people, wherever they'll have. Are all these perspectives of equal salience? Tomorrow, if the historian investigates that rape, what will the historian say? Instead of focusing on a violent act, will he keep talking about all these perspectives being there? Ultimately, you will end up saying that no rape happened because the police wala will deny it. The locality people will say she called for it. She was. These things don't happen in India. Many people think rape does not happen because all this is invited. Women get it done themselves. There are many people in Haryana and UP and other places who think like that all over India. That this is a figment of imagination. That they disagree later on, so they go and complain and so on. So tomorrow, if you have all these opinions, what is the historian supposed to make of it? let's say Holocaust. I mean, that's how the postmodernists got caught in the 70s. They said, okay, tell us, did the Holocaust happen or not? Is it a historically verifiable truth or not? Or is that also a matter of subjective perception? Tomorrow you will say Hitler did not exist. It is only by it exists. He exists only in your perception. How is that possible? You know, things like these, you can actually catch them. Apart from the fact that there is economic history, without which the postmodernists cannot work. He uses the computer, he uses the typewriter, he uses the internet, he uses all the commodities produced by society. Are those commodities not real? I mean, as Raymond Williams, there's a history of those commodities also. No? That's also real history. Tomorrow you will say, okay, this is. I mean, I hold this. I mean, it is there because I perceive it. It is not there. This is like, I mean, this is Husserl's thinking. This phenomenology which ultimately led to Martin Heidegger joining the Nazi party, right? And all these guys are his students. And that Heidegger never recanted. He had a flourishing career even in West Germany, where all the Nazis were rehabilitated. You keep saying, ye nahi hota, wo nahi hota. Postmodernism was deliberately promoted in the American academia to drive out scientific history and leftist history from academics. That is the actual real basis of postmodernism and its importance to American history writing and in the American establishment. They drove out all the others, most of the others who did not agree with them. Of course, thankfully, that fashion is over now, so nobody takes them seriously anymore.
Thank you so much, sir, and thank you so much, ma'am, for taking out time to deliver these lectures. I would like to invite one of our faculty members, Dr. Amarjit Singh, sir, to deliver the vote of thanks. Sir, if you can unmute yourself.
Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
It was a pleasure indeed to hear some prominent historians today on the theme history, historians and historians' craft. There is no denying, and it is very central to most of us who are the history disciplines practitioners and students of history. So right from Madam Sehgal, Dr. Madam Sehgal, to Professor Deshpande and Professor Harbans Mukhia, they gave a very meaningful lecture indeed, and many things which we came to know through this particular lecture regarding mythology or how to reconcile film with the construction of history, and then later going to analysis school in conceptualizing historical time and all that. It was indeed fascinating. I am sure that people must have learned a lot out of the discussion today. And the whole credit goes to History Society and Mr. Isan and his team, who did organize a wonderful lecture series. And I suppose that most of the students who participated in this lecture must have benefited hell of a lot, because history is a kind of discipline which invites a lot of ire and fire from many quarters, and it at times becomes a kind of football to be punched from one stand to another and all that, and that creates a lot of problem as well in terms of searching for the objective truth in history. As Professor Pandey has said, historian's task is very, very difficult and almost like a detective in terms of ascertaining the credibility and authenticity of facts and evidences. So I value their participation and the way they separated their time for this lecture, and I deeply and heartily thank all of them, all the participants and all the distinguished guests today who gave us the lecture today. Thank you, thanks a lot, and particularly to Isan Sharma.
Thank you so much, sir. And as in any point of time in history, understanding the historian's craft is important today as well and is relevant. And we hope that through this workshop, through this lecture series, students, especially at the bachelor's level in Delhi University, and because we are we were joined by students from foreign universities as well. So we hope that this workshop and this lecture series is going to be very helpful for them. And because as research is on the decline, especially in humanities, we think that through these workshops we can revive the love for history for this discipline. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. Thank you so much to our special guests, eminent historians who took part and who agreed to deliver these lectures. These lectures will be available on the Facebook page of the History Society, Dyal Singh College, and you can go back and you can listen to it anytime. And they are saved for posterity. So thank you so much, man. Thank you so much, sir, and have a great day.